Orson Ketteridge didn't knock. He never did. He rode straight through the open gate of Bram Voss's property on a Tuesday morning like the land already belonged to him, 3 men trailing behind him on horses that cost more than Bram's entire herd. He pulled up short in the yard, looked around at the cracked earth, and the fence posts leaning sideways, and the garden that was more dust than green, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he sees exactly what he expected to see. "Voss," he called out, not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. "I heard you've been having trouble." He hadn't come to help. He'd come to watch, and to make an offer that wasn't really an offer at all. That was the moment Bram Voss understood that some men don't wait for you to fall. They just show up early to make sure you land harder. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been left behind, or refused to quit when everything said you should subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the end, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The sun had been punishing the Colorado high country for 11 straight days when Bram Voss first heard the sound. He almost didn't stop. He was 3 miles from his own property, riding along the upper cut of Cinder Creek ravine with an empty canteen and a mood to match, and the last thing he needed was someone else's problem added on top of his own. The creek was barely running. His well had dropped 2 feet in a month. He had $43 in a tin box under his bed, and a list of debts that he'd stopped looking at, because looking didn't help anything. He pulled up anyway. The sound came again, not loud enough to be a call for help. More like the sound of someone past the point of calling. A dry, exhausted noise that a human throat makes when it's been crying and has run out of water to cry with. Bram turned his horse toward the ravine edge and looked down. The wagon had come apart on the descent. One wheel had cracked clean off and lodged against a boulder 30 feet below the trail, and the wagon itself had slid sideways and was now wedged at an ugly angle, tilted hard to the left, with the canvas half collapsed inward. The 2 mules that had pulled it were still in their harnesses, alive but still, their sides heaving in the heat. Around the wagon, in whatever shade the tilted canvas threw, 5 children were sitting or lying in the dirt. 5, Bram counted them twice before he trusted his own eyes. The youngest was so small he might have been 3 years old, maybe 4. He was lying on his side with his knees pulled up, and even from 30 feet above on the ravine rim, Bram could see the way the boy's breathing moved shallow and fast, like a bird that's been caught and is going too quickly toward the end of something. A woman was crouched beside the boy with her hand on his cheek. She was not looking up. She was not calling for help. She was just there, holding her hand against that small, hot face, which was the only thing she had left to offer. Bram tied his horse to a scrub pine and picked his way down the ravine wall. He made enough noise that she heard him coming. She was on her feet before he reached the bottom, and she had a short-handled hatchet in her right hand that she was holding with enough steadiness to tell him she knew how to use it. He stopped 10 feet out and put both hands where she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. She didn't lower the hatchet. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, maybe a few years either side, with dark hair matted to the side of her face and eyes that were red-rimmed and absolutely dry, because there was nothing left to come out of them. "You riding with anyone?" she asked. "No, where from?" "Ranch about 3 miles north, Cinder Creek. Name's Bram Voss." She watched him for a long moment. Behind her, one of the older children, a boy of maybe 13, tall and raw-boned, stood up slowly and squared his shoulders like he was ready to do something, though what that something might be was unclear. The woman didn't lower the hatchet all at once. She lowered it in stages, like trust was something she had to release in small amounts rather than all at once. "Eloin Harrow," she said. "These are my children." Bram looked at the boy on the ground. "How long has he been like that?" "Since yesterday morning." "Has he had water today?" "We ran out this morning." Bram unhooked his canteen from his belt. It was empty. He'd drunk the last of it an hour ago. He looked at it for a second like maybe he'd been wrong, then hung it back. "I've got water at my place," he said. "I can go get it and come back." Or he looked at the wagon, at the snapped wheel, at the mules. "Or I can bring my horse down here and rig something to carry the boy, and we can get everyone out at once." The woman, Eloin, looked at him like she was working something out inside her head. Not whether he was safe. That calculation was already finished. She was working out something harder, whether accepting help made her weak, or whether refusing it made her foolish. Those were 2 different kinds of pride, and they didn't always point in the same direction. "What's the boy's name?" Bram asked. "Finn," she said. "He's 4. Okay." Bram crouched down and looked at Finn without touching him. The boy's lips were cracked. His color was wrong. Not just heat, there was something else going on underneath the heat, something that had started before the wagon broke, and the water ran out. "Okay, I'm going back up for my horse and then we're moving." He looked up at the 4 other children, the tall boy who'd stood up. A girl of maybe 10 with her arms wrapped around a younger girl of 7 or 8. and another boy sitting apart from the rest with his back against the wagon wheel, watching Bram with an expression that was not quite suspicion, and not quite hope, but somewhere in the narrow, bruised territory between them. "You children need anything right now? Anyone hurt?" Nobody spoke. The tall boy shook his head. "All right," Bram stood. "Give me 10 minutes. He went back up the ravine wall faster than he'd come down. Getting Finn up the ravine wall was not the orderly operation Bram had pictured when he'd said it out loud. His horse, a gray gelding named Cutter, that had seen enough strange things to stay calm through most of them, did not particularly want to descend into the ravine at the angle required. Bram spent 6 minutes arguing with him at the lip before the horse gave in, and by the time they were all the way down, Eloin had wrapped Finn in a piece of canvas she'd pulled from the broken wagon and was standing with him in her arms, and Bram could see that Finn was heavier than she was making it look. She handed the boy over without ceremony when Bram reached her. She just held him out, and Bram took him, and for a moment neither of them said anything about what that meant, a woman handing her sick child to a stranger. Finn weighed almost nothing. That was the part that stayed with Bram longer than anything else from that first hour. A 4-year-old boy should have some weight to him. This one felt like he was already halfway somewhere else. They got up the ravine with the children going first. Eloin had them ordered by size. The youngest girls together in the middle, the tall boy named Silas at the back, making sure nobody slipped. He was 13, Bram learned later, but he moved like a boy who'd been doing the work of older people for long enough that he'd stopped thinking of himself as young. At the top, Bram settled Finn against him on Cutter's back, and they started the 3 miles north. Eloin walked. All of them walked. Bram offered Cutter for the smallest girl, Rena, 6 years old, with her sister Bia, 1 year older, and Eloin refused for about 30 seconds, before she saw that Rena's feet were beginning to blister through her shoes, and she said yes. So they went that way, Bram on foot leading Cutter with Finn pressed against him with one arm, and Rena perched carefully behind the saddle. Eloin and Silas and the 2 middle children, a boy named Tobin, 6, and a girl named Petra, 9, all walking in the thin shade of what shade there was, which was not enough. The middle boy, Tobin, was the one who surprised Bram. He walked the whole 3 miles without complaint and without drama, just steady and quiet, watching everything. Petra held Bee's hand the whole time and kept up a low, constant murmur that seemed to be some sort of story she was telling, though Bram couldn't hear the words. Silas walked behind everyone and said nothing to anyone. He had his mother's eyes careful and measuring, and he watched Bram with those eyes the entire 3 miles. Bram felt the watching. He didn't turn to meet it. He understood that some kinds of trust take longer than an afternoon, and that a 13-year-old boy who'd watched his family get stranded in a ravine with a sick baby brother was not going to warm to a stranger just because that stranger happened along at the right moment. That was fair. Bram couldn't afford to take it personally. The ranch at Cinder Creek was not an impressive sight. Bram knew this. He'd known it for long enough that he'd stopped being embarrassed by it and had moved into something more like resignation, the kind where you see the cracks in a thing so often they start to look like part of the design. The main house was a single large room with a sleeping loft above it, solid but plain, with a porch that sagged on the east end where a support post had sunk. The barn needed its roof patched in 3 places. The garden ran 50 feet along the south side of the house and was currently producing about a third of what it should have been, because the soil was tired and the water was scarce, and Bram had been too stretched to give it the attention it needed. He watched Eloin take it all in when they came through the gate. She didn't say anything. He gave her credit for that. He got Finn's side and onto his own bed and covered the boy with a sheet and went back out to the pump and worked it until the water ran cool and brought 2 full buckets inside. He gave each child water from a ladle and told them to go slow, which Silas immediately repeated to the others in a tone that suggested this was his normal role. And they listened to him the way they only listened to someone they'd been listening to for a long time. Elefin sat beside Finn and held the ladle to his lips and got a little water into him, and the boy stirred enough to swallow, which was the first thing that had gone the right way all day. Bram made a fire and heated what he had: dried beans that had been soaking since morning, a half loaf of bread that was going stiff, some salt pork that he sliced thin and fried until it was done. He put it all on the table, and the children ate in the particular way that children eat when they have been genuinely hungry, fast at first, then slower as the edge came off, then quiet and almost careful, as if they wanted the food to know it was appreciated. Eloin didn't eat until everyone else had. Bram noticed that. He filed it away without making anything of it. When the children were settled, Rena and Bia on a blanket by the wall, Tobin asleep almost before he finished his plate, Petra arranging her small siblings with a motherly seriousness that was either touching or heartbreaking, depending on how you looked at it. Eloin came and sat at the far end of the table from Bram. "I'll tell you what happened," she said, not offered. Told. like it was a thing she'd decided and was going through with before she could talk herself out of it. You don't have to, Bram said. I know I don't have to. She folded her hands on the table. They were rough hands, the kind that had done real work for years, and there was a cut on her left palm that she'd wrapped with a strip of cotton and hadn't mentioned. His name was Eloin Harrow. He arranged the marriage through a broker in Missouri. Letters for 3 months, then a contract. Then I put everything we had into the fare and came west. She stopped. Bram waited. He met us at the station in Pueblo. She looked at the table. He looked at the children. I could see him counting. He'd known about Silas. I'd told him about Silas. He hadn't known about the others. You had 4 children you hadn't mentioned? I had mentioned them. Her jaw tightened. He had not read carefully. Bram picked up his coffee cup and realized it was empty and set it back down. He gave me $40 and told me he was sorry. He couldn't do it. 5 children was more than he'd understood. He said the word. She stopped. Started again. He said they were too many. He said it like they were a problem with a shipment, and then he left. The room was quiet enough that Bram could hear Tobin breathing in his sleep near the wall. He left you in Pueblo? He left us in Pueblo with $40, 3 days later than we'd planned, which is why we were short on water when we tried to cross the ravine country. I miscalculated the distance. She looked up. I don't miscalculate often. I want you to know that, I believe you, Bram said. She studied him for a moment to see if he meant it. Apparently she decided he did, because something in her face shifted, not softened, exactly, but changed, the way iron changes when it's been in the fire long enough to lose some of its brittleness. I don't know what we're going to do, she said. It sounded like something it had cost her to say. I have $31. I have 5 children. Finn is sick and I don't know how sick. And I have. She looked around the room at the plain walls and the low ceiling and the sagging porch just visible through the window. I have nothing to offer anyone. Bram thought about what he was going to say before he said it. My garden's half dead, he said. I've got chickens that aren't laying right, and I don't know why. My fence on the north side is down in 2 places, and I keep patching it instead of fixing it. And I've got $43 in a tin under my bed and more debt than I like to think about. He turned his cup in his hands. So we're about even. She stared at him. That's not a comforting picture. No, he said, but it's an honest one. She stayed. She didn't say she was staying, exactly. She said she needed a few days while Finn recovered. And Bram said fine. And those few days became a week without either of them formally extending the arrangement. On the second day, Eloin found his garden situation more offensive than he'd prepared her for. You're watering wrong, she said, standing at the edge of the plot with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that he'd come to understand meant she was already 3 steps ahead of him. You're watering in the afternoon. I water when I have time. The afternoon sun pulls it right out of the soil. You're losing half of what you put in. She walked the length of the plot, looking at the soil between the plants. And these rows are too close. The plants are competing. I planted them like the seed packet said. She looked at him the way people look at other people who have said something earnest but not quite right. The seed packet is not written for land like this. Bram didn't argue with her, partly because she seemed to know what she was talking about, and partly because the garden had been failing and he'd been doing it the same way for 3 years, and the definition of that particular kind of stubbornness was doing the same thing and expecting a different result. She reorganized the watering schedule, morning and evening, the cooler ends of the day, and she taught Silas and Petra how to do it so it didn't fall to one person. She thinned the rows. She found a patch of ground near the barn that got better light and put in the seedlings she'd pulled, which Bram had assumed were weeds. The chickens were a different problem. Eloin stood in the chicken yard on the 3rd morning and watched the 8 hens with the focused attention of someone who is reading a language others can't see. They're not drinking enough, she said. The water's right there. Bram pointed to the trough. The trough is too deep. She picked up a stick and measured the inside depth. Young hens especially won't reach in far enough. They get thirsty and they stop laying. She looked at him. You need a shallower edge. I've had that trough for 6 years. And how long have the chickens not been laying right? He thought about it. About 6 months. When did you get these particular hens? He thought about that too. About 7 months ago. Eloin picked up the trough and dumped the water out and walked to the barn without explaining herself. She came back with a piece of old lumber and a hatchet and spent 20 minutes modifying the trough's inner edge with Tobin, handing her things and watching with the focused attention of a child who wants to understand how things work. The hens were laying properly within 4 days. Bram watched all of this happen and felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Wasn't gratitude exactly. Or not only gratitude. It was more like the feeling of realizing that the thing you thought was a fixed and permanent problem was actually just a problem no one had looked at from the right angle yet. Silas was harder. The boy did his work. Bram couldn't argue with that. He was up before sunrise, most mornings, And when Bram asked him to do something, he did it without complaint, and usually without having to be told twice. But he had a wall around him that Bram recognized because he'd built similar walls himself at similar ages, and he didn't push at it. What broke through wasn't effort or conversation. It was a fence post. The north fence needed more than patching. Bram had been saying so to himself for a year, which meant the problem had officially gotten worse. He went out one afternoon with 2 replacement posts and the tools and found Silas already there, trying to dig the old post free with a shovel that was too short for the job. Bram didn't say anything. He picked up the longer digger bar from the truck bed and went to work on the other post. They worked side by side for an hour without talking. Bram showed when there was something to show, but he didn't announce it. He just did it in a way Silas could see, and Silas watched and adjusted what he was doing accordingly. At the end of the hour, with both posts in and tamped, Silas said, "The wire's also loose further along." "I know," Bram said. "I can fix it if you show me how." Bram looked at him. 13, but with that old quality in his eyes. "Yeah, I'll show you." It was not a dramatic moment, but it was a real one, and real moments are often smaller than the dramatic ones and mean more. Finn came back. Not all at once. A little each day, the way health returns to someone who's been very sick in increments that are hard to see until you look back from a distance. By the 5th day, he was sitting up. By the 7th, he was eating properly. By the 10th, he was following Bram around the yard with the unself-conscious attachment that small children apply to anyone who is large and steady and present. Bram was not prepared for being followed. He'd been alone on the ranch for 4 years, since his wife left a thing that was complicated enough that he'd buried most of it under work, which was where he kept most things he didn't know how to handle. He had never exactly decided to stay alone. It had just become the arrangement gradually, and arrangements have a way of becoming facts if you leave them long enough. So Finn following him around the yard was something he didn't know what to do with. The boy would appear at his elbow while he was checking the water line or splitting wood, and just stand there, watching, occasionally picking up a piece of wood shaving or a pebble and examining it with total seriousness. Bram tried talking to him. He didn't have a lot of experience talking to 4-year-olds. "What do you think about this post?" he asked one afternoon, pointing to a fence post he was bracing. Finn looked at it. "It's crooked," he said. Bram looked at it. "Yeah," he said, "it is." Finn looked at him. "Are you going to fix it?" "That's what I'm trying to do." "Oh." Finn looked at the post again. "Okay." Later that evening, Bram mentioned to Eloin that Finn had told him the post was crooked. Eloin looked up from the shirt she was mending. She'd found a piece of torn linen in his trunk and was already making it useful, because that seemed to be the way she operated. Nothing wasted, and she almost smiled. "He's been calling things crooked since he learned the word," she said. "He called a neighbor's house crooked once." To the neighbor's face. "What did the neighbor say?" "Nothing, the house was crooked." She went back to the shirt. "Finn has very good eyes." Bram thought about that and decided it was probably both a gift and an inconvenience, depending on the day. Orson Ketteridge showed up on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Eloin and the children had come to stay. Bram heard the horses before he saw them. He was at the pump when the sound reached him, and he stood up and turned to see 4 riders coming through the open gate. Ketteridge at the front on his big bay horse that he rode the way rich men ride things they own, with a kind of effortless command that is less about horsemanship than about the confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged. Ketteridge was 50-something, wide in the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked like authority, if you didn't look too carefully. He wore a good hat and a better coat, and his boots were the kind you don't wear to work. He ran the largest ranch in the county, and he'd been running it long enough that he'd started to think the county itself was a kind of extension of his operation. He pulled up at the pump and looked around with the same slow survey a man does when he's pricing a property. "Voss," he said, "I heard you've been having trouble." "Morning, Ketteridge. Heard your creek's running low. Half the county's dry this summer." He said this with a tone of general concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Drought like this, a man starts to wonder if he's in the right business. "I'm still wondering," Bram said. Ketteridge looked at the house. The children's voices were coming through the open window, Petra and Bea in some kind of disagreement, Tobin telling them both to be quiet in a voice that sounded remarkably like Eloin's. Ketteridge looked at the window for a moment longer than was casual. "You've got people staying with you," he said. "I have guests," Bram said. The word was deliberate. "Right." Ketteridge turned back to him. "Look, Voss, I'm going to be straight with you. This place has been struggling since Dora left." He used Bram's ex-wife's name the way some men use information they've collected, as a reminder that they know things. "And the drought's not helping. I've been thinking I might take it off your hands. Fair price, more than fair. Enough for you to start clean somewhere else." Bram looked at him. "The water rights go with the land," Ketteridge added. "That's really what I'm after, I'll be honest. Your upstream access on Cinder Creek is valuable to me. The rest of the property you can negotiate." Bram thought about the $43 in the tin under his bed. He thought about the debt list he'd stopped looking at. He thought about how easy it would be to say yes, to take whatever Ketteridge was offering and walk away from the cracked soil and the fence posts and the dead end of this particular story. Then he heard Finn's voice through the window, asking Tobin something, and Tobin answering with that 6-year-old authority that children develop when they've had to grow up fast. No, Bram said. Ketteridge didn't look surprised. He hadn't expected, yes, this visit was an opening move, not a closing one. Think about it, he said. Offer won't always be on the table. I'll think about it, Bram said, which was a polite way of saying he'd already thought about it. Ketteridge looked at the house one more time, then turned his horse and rode back out through the gate. His 3 men followed without a word. Bram stood at the pump and watched them go. The morning was already hot and getting hotter, and Cinder Creek was running low, and there were 7 people on his property now instead of 1, and his debt list had not gotten shorter while he wasn't looking at it. He went inside and told Eloin about the visit. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He'll come back." "I know. What are you going to do?" Bram looked at the table, at the scrape marks where Silas had been working on something with a knife the previous evening, at the coffee cup that was too small for the number of people now using it, at the shirt Eloin had mended and hung carefully on the hook by the door. "I'm going to stay," he said. Eloin looked at him. "That's not a plan." "No," he said. "But it's a start." She went back to what she'd been doing, and Bram went back outside to check on the fence, and the morning continued the way mornings do when the threat has passed but not disappeared, carrying the particular weight of something that isn't finished, only interrupted. The fence didn't fix itself while Bram and Ketteridge were having their conversation, and it didn't fix itself in the days that followed either. Bram knew that, but he also knew that some problems can wait a week, and some can't, and right now the thing that couldn't wait was the north pasture wire that Silas had pointed out. Because if the cattle got through there, they'd be on Ketteridge's land by morning, and that was a different kind of trouble entirely. So he went back to the fence, and Silas was already there waiting for him with the wire stretcher, which he'd found in the barn without being told where to look. Bram didn't say anything about that. He just picked up his end and they went to work. It took most of the morning. The wire had rusted through in 2 places and needed replacing, not just tightening, and the second post along the run had rotted at the base enough that pulling the wire tight would just pull the post over. Bram dug it out and set a new one while Silas held the wire back out of the way. And somewhere in the middle of that process, while they were both dirty and the sun was already making the day feel longer than it was, Silas said, "He's going to come back, isn't he? That man." Bram looked up from the post hole. "Ketteridge?"
"Yeah, probably."
Silas worked the wire stretcher one more turn. "What does he actually want?" Bram tamped the post base with the heel of the digger bar. "The water rights on Cinder Creek. Upstream access. If he controls the water, he controls everything downstream, including my place. He doesn't particularly want my land. He just wants what runs through it." Silas thought about that. "So even if you sold him the land, he'd still want the water. If I sold him the land, he'd have the water. It goes with the deed. And if you don't sell, then he finds another way to get it." Silas looked at the wire in his hands. He was the kind of boy who needed to understand the whole shape of a problem before he could settle with it. And Bram recognized that quality because he shared it, and because it was simultaneously an asset and an inconvenience, depending on what the problem happened to be. "My mother's not going to let him push you out," Silas said. It wasn't a boast, it was an observation delivered in the same flat, certain tone a man uses when he's describing a geographical fact. "I know," Bram said. "She pushed back against our last landlord in Missouri, and he was twice the size of Ketteridge." Silas paused. He backed down. "What did she do?" The boy almost smiled. "She kept records of everything. Every payment, every conversation. She wrote it all down. When he tried to throw us out early, she had documentation of every agreement he'd ever broken. He couldn't argue with her because she had it all in writing, and he didn't." Bram straightened up and looked at the newly set post. "Your mother ever mention anything about water law?" Silas looked at him. "I don't know, but she reads a lot." "I'll talk to her," Bram said. They finished the fence line and walked back to the house with the tools, and Bram noticed that Silas walked beside him now instead of behind, which was a small shift but a real one. Eloin was in the kitchen when they came in, and she was not alone. She'd rearranged the table, pushed it closer to the window for better light, and she had 3 things going at once: a pot on the stove, a piece of mending in her lap, and Petra sitting across from her doing figures on a scrap of paper while Eloin corrected them without looking up from the mending. 7 times 8 is not 54, she said to Petra. 56, Petra said without looking up either. Yes. Bram and Silas came in, and Eloin glanced up and registered the state of them, dirty, tired fence wire still on Silas's gloves, and went back to the mending. "Fence," she said. "Done," Silas said. "Good. She set the mending aside and stood up. Wash up. Both of you. Bram washed up. He was not entirely sure at what point a woman he'd known for 3 weeks had acquired the authority to tell him to wash up in his own house, but he found he didn't object to it the way he'd have expected to. It felt less like being told and more like being included in something, which were two experiences that looked similar on the outside and felt entirely different on the inside. At the table that evening, with all 5 children in various states of eating and not eating and arguing quietly about who had more beans, Bram told Eloin about Ketteridge's interest in the water rights. She listened without interrupting. She had that quality, the ability to hear something through to the end before she responded, which was rarer than it should have been. When he finished, she said, "Do you have the original deed?" "In the strong box under the bed." "And the water claim paperwork? The upstream filing?" "Should be with it. I want to look at it tomorrow morning." Bram nodded. "There's something else." He turned his cup in his hands. "The upstream claim isn't entirely settled. There's a section of the creek about a mile north of the property boundary where the filing got complicated. Some young fellow named Adler bought a parcel up there 2 years ago. He filed a water claim, but I don't think he's developed it. If Ketteridge gets to Adler and convinces him to sell or reassign the claim, then Ketteridge controls the water above you," Eloin said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Tobin knocked his cup over, and Petra righted it before the spill spread, and neither of them made a fuss about it, which was the kind of small efficiency that develops in families where chaos has been lived with long enough to become routine. "Adler," Eloin said. "Do you know him?" "Not well. Young, maybe 25. He came up from Denver with money and ideas and hasn't quite figured out what the land actually requires yet." "Has Ketteridge approached him?" "Not that I know of. But Ketteridge thinks in moves. He won't come at me directly, he'll work around me." Eloin looked at the table. "Then you need to get to Adler first." "I know, and you need something to offer him. Not money. Something that makes keeping the claim worthwhile to him." She looked up. "What does he need?" Bram thought about it. "He's been trying to run cattle on that upper parcel. Hasn't had much luck. The land's rocky and the grazing's thin. Could you help him with that?" "I know cattle." "Yes. Then that's your offer." She picked up the mending again. "You help him with the cattle. He keeps the claim filed in his name where Ketteridge can't touch it. You negotiate some kind of right of access for Cinder Creek. Everyone benefits except Ketteridge." Bram looked at her. "You worked this out just now?" "I worked it out about halfway through what you were telling me," she said without looking up. I didn't want to interrupt. Silas, from the far end of the table, put his fork down very carefully and looked at his plate. Bram caught the boy's eye. Silas looked back with an expression that meant something like "I told you." August settled in over the Colorado high country like something that wasn't planning to leave, and the ranch at Cinder Creek began to change in ways that were hard to point to specifically but impossible to miss if you'd known the place before. The garden was the most obvious. In the 2 weeks since Eloin had reorganized the watering and replanted the crowded rows, the green had returned in a way that surprised even Bram, who knew the soil better than anyone and had stopped expecting much from it. The beans came in heavy. The squash sent out runners that had to be redirected twice a week. The tomato plants, which had been producing 1 or 2 fruit at a time in that desultory way of plants that have given up hope, began to cluster with fruit that was still hard and green, but present in a quantity that suggested something had changed in the soil's opinion of its own possibilities. Eloin knew what she'd done, and she didn't make a performance of it. She walked the rows in the early morning while the dew was still on things, and she noted what needed doing, and she did it or assigned it to whichever child was closest. The children had become an agricultural workforce in a way that was both impressive and occasionally chaotic. Petra was the most reliable. She was 9, and she had her mother's organizational instinct, so she approached the garden rows the way her mother approached the mending methodically, one thing at a time with a running tally in her head of what was done and what wasn't. She had taken over the twice-daily chicken watering without being asked, and she'd noticed on her own that one of the hens was favoring her left foot, and she'd mentioned it to Eloin in the same tone she might use to report a math answer. Tobin was enthusiastic but directionally challenged. He had a tendency to weed the wrong things and to water what had already been watered and to help with whatever project seemed most interesting rather than most necessary. He had enormous goodwill and a short attention span, and Bram found him genuinely difficult to be annoyed with because the boy was always trying, even when what he was trying had no particular relationship to what actually needed doing. Bea was 6 and largely operated in her own universe. She could be trusted with simple, specific tasks: carry this bucket, hold this wire, watch Finn, and she executed them with total seriousness. But she could not be given complex instructions because, by the second step, she would have become interested in something else, and the instruction would have dissolved. Finn at 4 was Bram's shadow. This had not been negotiated. It had simply become the arrangement, the way arrangements do when nobody formally objects. Wherever Bram went, within reason, Finn appeared within 5 minutes. He didn't help in any practical sense, he observed. He carried things that were too small to need carrying. He asked questions that were often unanswerable, and sometimes surprisingly sharp. One morning he watched Bram check the water level in the well and said, "Is it getting lower?" Bram looked at the mark he'd scratched on the stone. Little. "Why, not enough rain." Finn considered this. "Can you make it rain?" "Why not?" "Nobody can." Finn looked at the sky with an expression of mild skepticism, as if he suspected this was more complicated than Bram was letting on, and then went back to examining a piece of dead wood he'd found. Bram went back to worrying about the water, which was something he did in the background of everything now, a constant low note underneath the daily work. The creek was down to about half its normal flow. If it dropped much further, the garden would need hand-carrying water rather than furrow irrigation, which would cost time they didn't have. And if Ketteridge got his hands on the upstream claim, the calculation got worse. He rode up to see Adler that same week. The parcel north of his property line was rocky and open, just as he'd described it to Eloin, with the thin, patchy grass that cattle could survive on but not thrive on. Adler's operation was small 8-head, a modest cabin, a lean-to barn that looked like it had been built in a hurry by someone who'd read about barns, but not spent much time around them. Adler himself was exactly what Bram had expected, young and earnest and slightly overwhelmed, with the look of a man who has discovered that enthusiasm and capital do not automatically substitute for experience. He had good intentions and better funding than most, and a persistent gap between the two. He was suspicious at first. Men who came calling on undeveloped land usually wanted something, and he'd had enough people want things from him in the past 2 years to develop a reasonable caution. Bram didn't hide what he wanted. He sat across from Adler in the cabin and told him straight about the water claim, about Ketteridge, about the upstream access, and what it meant to Cinder Creek. He told it plainly, without drama, and he watched Adler's face move through a series of expressions that told him the young man had not understood the value of what he was sitting on. "Ketteridge approached you yet?" Bram asked. No, Adler looked uncomfortable. He sent a man around in June asking about the parcel in general. I figured he was prospecting. He's measuring what he can get and how. Bram leaned forward. "Here's what I can offer you. I know this type of land. I know what cattle need up here and what they don't, and I can tell you in an afternoon what's costing you half your herd's weight. In exchange, I want a written right of access to the creek water, not ownership. Just access, and I want you to keep that upstream claim filed in your name and not reassigned or sold without talking to me first." Adler looked at him. "Why should I keep the claim if I'm not using it fully?" "Because the day you let it lapse or sell it to Ketteridge, he owns the water 2 miles downstream, and I stop being a neighbor you have an agreement with. You want Ketteridge as your nearest neighbor instead of me. That's your business. But I'll tell you what I know of him, and it's not a short story." Adler was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what's wrong with my cattle first," he said. "Then we talk about the rest." Bram spent 2 hours with Adler's cattle. It didn't take long to see the problem. The grazing rotation was off. The animals were working the same ground without recovery time, and there was a mineral deficiency, showing in 3 of the 8 head that would cost Adler 2 winters of diminished gain if he didn't address it now. He told Adler all of it without dressing it up, and Adler listened and took notes in a small book he pulled from his shirt pocket, and by the end of it they had something close to an agreement. It wasn't a legal document. Bram would come back with Silas to help draft something proper later, but they shook hands on the substance of it, and Bram rode home with the particular lightness of someone who has taken one problem and turned it into something that might, with care, become something else. The lightness lasted about 4 days. What ended it was not Ketteridge. It was something smaller and more ordinary, and in some ways harder to manage, the specific friction of 7 people sharing a space that had been built and arranged for one. Bram was not a man who'd lived with people for a long time. 4 years of solitude had reshaped his habits in ways he hadn't noticed until they started colliding with someone else's. He was used to silence in the morning. He was used to knowing where everything in the kitchen was. He was used to the particular rhythm of his own days when he worked, when he stopped, what he ate, how he organized hours between dark and dark. All of that was gone now. The mornings were loud from the moment the children woke, which was earlier than Bram would have chosen. The kitchen had been reorganized twice by Eloin to be more practical, which it genuinely was, but he kept reaching for things in their old places and finding air. The rhythm of the days had become something collective, something negotiated, something shaped by 7 different sets of needs rather than one. He wasn't unhappy about it. That was the strange part. He wasn't unhappy, but he was tired in a way he hadn't been tired when he was alone. and sometimes in the evenings when the children were finally quiet, and Eloin was mending or reading, and the house had gone still, he'd find himself sitting on the porch with nothing to say to anyone, just staring at the dark, resting in the silence. Eloin found him like that one evening about a month in. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down in the other chair without asking if he wanted company, which was characteristic of her. She assessed whether a thing was needed and acted accordingly, without making a ceremony of the assessment. She handed him a cup. He took it. "You're not sorry you did it," she said. Not a question. "No, but it's harder than you thought." He looked at the dark. "I thought it would be hard." "That's different from it actually being hard." He drank the coffee. It was good she'd made it stronger than he usually did, which he'd initially found too much and had quietly adjusted to. "I don't know how you do it," he said. 5 of them. All the time. "You stop thinking of it as all the time," she said. "You just think of it as now, this minute. This problem. The next one," she paused. "If you think about all of it at once, it's impossible. No one can manage all of it at once." Bram thought about that. "Is that how you manage? One thing at a time?" "It's how I survive," she said, which was a slightly different answer, and she didn't explain the difference, but he understood it anyway. They sat for a while without talking. The night sounds came and went, a coyote somewhere in the middle distance, the horses shifting in the corral, Finn making a small noise inside that resolved itself without either of them having to get up. "Adler agreed to the arrangement," Bram said. "I know. Silas told me." Silas was there.
Yes.
Bram set his cup down on the porch rail. "Your boy is going to be something." Eloin was quiet for a moment. "He already is something," she said. "He's been something for a long time. It's just that nobody outside our family has seen it yet." Bram thought about the fence line, about the wire stretcher, about the way Silas had shown up without being told and worked without complaining, and spotted the problem further along that Bram hadn't gotten to yet. "No," he said, "I can see it." Something in Eloin's posture changed, not much, just a small degree, but Bram caught it. It was the change that happens when someone says the right thing, and the person hearing it hadn't realized how much they needed to hear it. She didn't say anything. After a moment, she went back inside. Bram stayed on the porch and finished his coffee and looked at the dark. The money problem didn't go away because they were managing the land better. It lurked at the edge of everything, patient the way debt is patient, in no hurry because it knew time was on its side. Bram's most pressing obligation was a note he'd taken out 2 years prior to repair the barn roof and replace the aging water pump, both necessary, both expensive, both due in installments that he'd been meeting but barely. The next installment was 6 weeks out. He had, after the minimal expenses of the past month, $58 in the tin under the bed. He needed 90. He did not tell Eloin this immediately. It wasn't pride exactly, or not entirely. It was more that the problem felt like his to carry, the way problems accumulate a kind of ownership when you've been alone with them long enough. And also he hadn't quite worked out yet what her knowing would change. She found out anyway, because she went looking for an old receipt she thought might be in the strongbox and found the note instead. And she came to him with it and set it on the table between them without any preamble. "When is this due?" she said. He told her. "And how short are you?" He told her that too. She sat across from him and looked at the note with the focus she applied to most practical problems, which was the focus of someone who has been solving problems for a long time and has stopped being surprised that problems exist. "I can sew," she said. I know. I can sew for money. There are women in Cartwright, the nearest town, 8 miles east, who need alterations and repair work and will pay for it. I've done it before. Not here, but in Missouri." She looked up. "I need fabric, thread, some needles. Most of it I have. The machine I have. If I start this week, by the time the note is due, it won't cover the gap on its own." Bram said no. "But it covers part of it. What covers the rest?" Bram looked at the note. "I've got 2 steers I can sell. I've been holding them because the price is low right now. But if I wait for the price to come back and miss the installment, the interest adds another." "Sell 1 steer," Eloin said. "Keep 1. 1 steer plus the sewing work should get you close enough that the difference is manageable." He looked at her. "You work that out right now?" "I worked it out while I was walking from the strongbox to here," she said. "Bram?" She said his name in a tone that wasn't unkind, but was direct in the particular way of someone who has stopped softening things because softening them doesn't help. "I'm not a guest. I told you that in the first week. If this ranch fails, my children have nowhere. So this ranch is not going to fail. Do you understand me?" He understood her. "Good," she said, and picked up the note and put it back in the strongbox, which she handed back to him in a way that meant she'd looked at everything else in it too, and had a full accounting, and had opinions about several of the other items, but was choosing to address only one thing at a time. She went back to the mending. Bram sat at the table and looked at the closed strongbox, and felt something he could only describe as steadied. The way a post feels steadied after it's been properly tamped. Still the same post. But not going anywhere. Eloin rode into Cartwright the following Wednesday in the wagon with Silas driving and Petra and Bea in the back. And she came home with 4 commissions for alterations, and a bolt of calico she'd bought with her own money, and a price agreement with the dry goods store to take in mending on a weekly basis. She told Bram about it at dinner. He said how much. She told him the weekly rate. He did the arithmetic. That's more than I expected. The woman at the dry goods store said she'd been trying to find someone reliable for 2 years. Eloin served herself from the pot. We're 8 miles out, not ideal. But she said reliable is more valuable to her than convenient. Tobin said, "What's reliable mean?" "It means you do what you say you're going to do," Petra said before anyone else could answer. "Every time," Bram added. Tobin thought about this and nodded slowly in the manner of a 6-year-old absorbing information he intends to return to later. Bram sold 1 steer that Friday. The price was low, just as he'd known it would be, and it stung in the specific way it always stings when you sell something for less than it's worth because you have to, rather than because you want to. But the stung feeling passed and the arithmetic worked, and the note installment was covered with $4 left over, which went back in the tin. The second steer, the one he'd kept, was a young black and white animal named by Finn, who had apparently been told he wasn't allowed to name the cattle, and had named the animal anyway on a day when no one was paying attention. The name was Post, for reasons that were unclear even to Finn when pressed on the question. Post stayed in the pasture and grew and paid no attention to any of the human dramas accumulating around him, which Bram felt was a healthy approach to life and occasionally envied. The community was not something Bram had sought out in his years at Cinder Creek, but it existed whether he engaged with it or not. There were 11 families within reasonable riding distance, and they operated with the loose interdependency of people who live close enough to need each other during emergencies and far enough apart to maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency the rest of the time. He'd been on good terms with most of them in a distant and non-committal way. He helped when asked, didn't ask for help unless he had no other option, showed up at the things you showed up at, and otherwise kept his own company. Since Dora had left 4 years ago, the arrangement had suited him fine. Eloin changed his relationship with the neighbors without exactly trying to. What happened was, the Fennel family, 3 miles southwest, had a sick horse and a husband down with a bad back, and word came through on a Tuesday that they were in trouble. Bram would ordinarily have ridden over with a couple of hours of help and left it at that. Eloin came with him. She brought Petra and Silas in a pot of something that smelled like it had been planned rather than improvised, and she went straight to the wife, Clara Fennel, who was trying to manage the horse and the husband and 3 young children and the household all at once, and was visibly failing all of them simultaneously. Bram had never seen Clara Fennel actually talk to anyone for more than 5 minutes about anything that wasn't weather or livestock. Within an hour of Eloin's arrival, she was sitting at her kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup and talking about her husband's back problem in the specific, unguarded way that people talk when someone has created a space for real conversation rather than the polite surface version. Silas and another Fennel boy took the horse. Petra managed the younger children. Bram fixed the back fence that Clara had been worrying about but hadn't been able to get to. When they left, Clara held Eloin's hand at the gate and said, "You come back." "I mean it, come back." "On the ride home," Bram said. "You do that on purpose." "Do what? Make people comfortable, make them talk." Eloin looked at the road. "I just listen," she said. "Most people don't get listened to enough. They talk too much when someone finally does it." "It's more than listening," Bram said. She didn't answer that. But Petra, from the back of the wagon, said, "Mama always says you can't build anything alone." Not really. Eloin didn't respond to this either, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that suggested the child had not said anything incorrect. The visits went both ways and faster than Bram expected. Clara Fennel came by the following week with a jar of preserved peaches and stayed for the better part of an afternoon. The Holt family to the north sent their oldest son around with an offer of help for any heavy work Bram needed done. No exchange required. They'd been watching Ketteridge circle the area, and they had their own opinions about it, and standing beside a neighbor seemed like the better strategy. Bram accepted the offer and put the Holt boy to work on the barn roof, which needed more than he could manage alone. The barn roof took 3 days. By the end of it, the Holt boy and Silas were on a first-name basis and had identified 2 other fence runs that needed attention, and were planning to address them together the following week. Bram watched this and felt the ranch changing under his feet in a way that wasn't only about the fence lines or the garden or the chickens or the note in the strongbox. It was something harder to measure. The difference between a piece of land one man is barely holding on to and a place where something is being built. He didn't know what to do with that feeling, so he did what he usually did with feelings. He didn't know what to do with, he went back to work. The evening things shifted between them, shifted in a way that wasn't about work or the ranch or the children or the money. It was an unremarkable Tuesday near the end of August, and it started with something as small as a disagreement about the fence on the south boundary. Bram wanted to repair it. Eloin thought they should replace the entire section, rather than keep patching. Patching is cheaper, Bram said. Patching costs you twice, she said. You patch it now. It holds for a season. It fails again. You patch it again. Replace it once. It holds for 10 years. I don't have the capital right now for a full replacement. So you wait until you do. You don't patch it again. If I don't patch it now, the cattle get through. Then put them in the north pasture for a month and wait until you can do it properly. Bram looked at her. The north pasture is short on grass right now. I know. She looked straight back at him. Which is more expensive, buying supplemental feed for a month or repatching a fence every season indefinitely? He knew the answer to that. He also knew that she knew the answer, and that she'd done the arithmetic before she'd walked into this conversation, which was characteristic of her in a way he'd come to recognize, and occasionally found maddening. You always know what you're going to say before you start saying it, he said. She blinked. Yes, he stopped. He'd been about to say annoying and then realized that wasn't quite right. It's not a criticism. I didn't take it as one. He turned away and looked at the fence line in question, which was doing its best to demonstrate both their positions simultaneously by being visibly inadequate. I'm used to being the one who thinks things through around here. Eloin was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. This is your ranch. That's not what I'm saying. I know that too. Her voice had gone quieter. Not softer, Eloin's voice didn't go soft exactly, but less armored.
What are you saying?
He turned back. She was looking at him with her arms crossed and the evening light behind her and an expression that was somewhere between patient and watchful. And he was struck, not for the first time, by the fact that she was not the person he'd thought she was when he'd looked down into that ravine. She was more complicated than that, more capable, and in some ways more difficult, and he wasn't sure what to do with any of it. I'm saying, he said, that I'm not used to someone else having the better plan. Eloin looked at him. Does that bother you? He thought about it honestly. Less than I'd have expected, he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned back toward the house. Replace the fence, she said. I'll help with the cost. Bram looked at the fence and then at her retreating back. We'll see, he said. She didn't turn around. No, we won't, she said. He stood there for a moment in the fading evening, and then he laughed a short, genuine sound that surprised him, and went after her back toward the lights of the house, where through the window he could already see Finn standing on a chair to look out at them. His small face pressed close to the glass, watching, as he always was, the way children watch the things they have decided they belong to. The south fence got replaced. Not all at once, they did it in sections, the way you do anything when the money is real and the margin is thin, but it got done. And Eloin was right about the cost comparison, which Bram acknowledged once and did not repeat, because once was sufficient, and she didn't need it repeated. September came in cooler than August had been, which was a mercy. The creek was still low but holding, and the garden had produced enough that Eloin had spent 2 full days putting things up, beans and squash and tomatoes in jars lined up along the kitchen shelf with the particular satisfaction of someone who has turned raw circumstances into something that will last. She didn't say she was satisfied. She just looked at the shelf once when she was done, and then went on to the next thing. The ranch had found a rhythm. Not a comfortable one. Comfortable implied ease, and ease was not a word that applied to any day at Cinder Creek, but a working rhythm. The kind where each person knows their part well enough that the day moves without too much negotiation. Silas and Bram handled the cattle and the heavy structural work. Petra ran the household mornings with a competence that continued to unsettle Bram slightly, because she was 9 and she managed the younger children's morning routine with more efficiency than most adults he'd known managed anything. Eloin split her time between the ranch work and the sewing commissions, which had grown from 4 to 9 clients in 6 weeks, and she made the 8 miles to Cartwright every Wednesday without complaint, in a wagon that still pulled slightly to the left because one wheel had a wobble Bram hadn't gotten to yet. He got to it the second week of September, while Eloin was in Cartwright, and the younger children were doing their lessons at the kitchen table under Petra's supervision, which had become the morning arrangement Eloin had been teaching them. And Petra had absorbed enough of the method to run it in her mother's absence, a fact that Petra accepted as simply part of what she did, and that Eloin had engineered so gradually that no one had noticed the transition until it was already complete. Bram was under the wagon, with the wheel off, when Silas came around the corner of the barn and said, "Tobin's hot." Bram set down the wrench. "How hot?" He was complaining at breakfast that his head hurt. I thought it was just, I thought he was being Tobin. But Petra just checked him and she said he feels like the stove. Bram came out from under the wagon. He went inside and put his hand on Tobin's forehead. The boy was burning. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his arithmetic paper in front of him, and the look of someone trying very hard to pretend nothing was wrong, which Tobin did about nothing under normal circumstances, which told Bram that he knew something was wrong and was scared of it. "Come on," Bram said, and picked him up. Tobin was 6 and not small, and it was a real weight, and carried him to the sleeping area and laid him down. "I'm not tired," Tobin said. "I know, I was going to finish my arithmetic. It'll wait." "Petra said I had to finish before." "Petra can adjust," Bram said. He got a wet cloth and put it on the boy's forehead and went back to the kitchen where Silas was standing, with his arms crossed, watching the door. "How bad's?" Silas said. "Bad enough." Bram thought about the last time he'd seen a fever like that. Not Finn's had been the creeping kind, the kind that came up slowly over days. This felt sharper. When did he start feeling off? Yesterday evening he didn't eat much. "I thought he was just being difficult." Was he being difficult yesterday? Silas thought about it. Less than usual, which I should have noticed. He said this the way he said most things that involved his own failures of attention, flatly, directly, without self-forgiveness or self-pity. "You noticed this morning," Bram said. "That's what matters." He went back to check the cloth. Tobin had pushed it off. Bram put it back, and Tobin accepted it this time without arguing, which was its own kind of information. The problem was that Eloin was 8 miles away in Cartwright and wouldn't be back until late afternoon, and the doctor was 15 miles in the other direction, in Harwick, and Bram had no way to reach either of them quickly. What he had was the medicine box, a metal tin that had lived on the top shelf of the kitchen for as long as the house had been standing, and contained the usual frontier pharmacopoeia, quinine, willow bark, a bottle of something the previous owner had labeled only as fever, which Bram had always been slightly suspicious of, and several things whose labels had faded past reading. He knew willow bark brought fever down. He'd used it on himself twice in the past 4 years, and it had worked after a fashion not fast but reliably. He made a strong tea of it and brought it to Tobin and managed to get about half of it into the boy, which required a level of negotiation that Bram was not naturally equipped for. "It tastes bad," Tobin said. "I know, really bad." "Yes, like dirt. Like medicine," Bram said, "which is what it is. Drink the rest." Tobin drank the rest with the expression of a martyr and lay back down and closed his eyes. And Bram sat on the edge of the cot and watched him breathe and tried to calculate whether the fever was the kind that breaks on its own if you manage it carefully, or the kind that doesn't. He couldn't tell. That was the honest answer. He'd seen both kinds, and they started the same way. Petra appeared in the doorway. She had Bea and Finn behind her in the way she always had them arranged, accounted for, managed. "Is he going to be okay?" she said. "Yes," Bram said. He said it with enough certainty that Petra accepted it and went back to managing Bea and Finn, which was its own full-time operation. He was not as certain as he'd sounded. But certainty was sometimes a thing you performed for children so they could keep functioning, and he'd learned that from watching Eloin do it often enough that he understood the practical necessity of it. By the time Eloin got back in the late afternoon, Tobin's fever had not broken. It had moved down a little, then back up in the restless pattern of a fever that is deciding what it wants to do. And Bram had been checking on him every 30 minutes and making him drink water and replacing the cloth on his forehead, and doing all of this while also managing the afternoon chores, which still needed doing regardless of what was happening inside. Eloin came through the door and read the house in about 4 seconds, the closed curtain in the sleeping area, the unusual quiet, Silas sitting at the table with an untouched cup in front of him. "Who?" she said. "Tobin," Bram said. She went straight in. Bram heard her low voice and Tobin's higher one, and then just her voice. After 5 minutes, she came back out. "How long?" she said. "Since this morning. Silas noticed at breakfast. I gave him willow bark tea around noon." She was already going back to the supply shelf. She knew exactly what was in the medicine box because she'd inventoried it in her first week and reorganized it and made a list of what needed replacing, which she'd given to Bram and which he'd been meaning to act on for 3 weeks. She looked at what was available and looked at the faded labels and then turned to Bram with a specific expression. "There's nothing here for this," she said. "Not if the fever doesn't break on its own by morning." "I know." "Dr. Haskell's in Harwick?" "Yes, 15 miles. She set the tin down. She was not panicking. Panic would have been easier to read. Honestly, panic is loud and visible. What Eloin did instead was go very still, in the way of someone running through every option simultaneously and reaching the same conclusion from multiple directions. "If it breaks by morning, we manage it here," she said. "If it doesn't, someone rides for Haskell." "That's what I figured. I'll sit with him tonight. We'll take turns," Bram said. She looked at him. She was going to argue. He could see it forming. The particular set of her jaw that meant she was about to tell him something was her responsibility, not his. "He's in my house," Bram said. "We take turns." The jaw thing didn't fully resolve, but she nodded. They took turns, Eloin from sundown to around 2 in the morning, Bram from 2 until dawn. He sat in the chair beside Tobin's cot in the dark, and listened to the boy breathe, and replaced the cloth when it went warm, and talked to him a little when Tobin stirred enough to half wake. "You're still here," Tobin said once, around 4 in the morning, in the groggy, confused voice of someone surfacing from deep. "Yes," Bram said. "Okay," Tobin said, and went back under. Bram sat in the dark and looked at the boy's face, younger looking in sleep. The way all children look younger in sleep. The daily performance of managing the world relaxed away, and felt something settle in him with a finality he hadn't expected. Not a decision, exactly. More like the recognition of something he'd already decided without quite putting language to it. These were his. Not legally, not biologically. But in the sense that actually mattered, they were his to worry about, his to sit up for, his to carry through ravines if it came to that. They had been since the moment he'd looked down into that ravine and gone down anyway. The fever broke at about 5:30 in the morning. He knew because Tobin's breathing changed, first deepened, evened out, and then the boy's skin, when Bram pressed the back of his hand to his forehead, was damp instead of burning. Bram sat back in the chair. He let out a breath that had been held in some form for about 18 hours. Then he went to wake Eloin. Tobin took 3 days to fully recover, which he spent mostly sleeping and occasionally demanding food and complaining about the weakness in his legs when he tried to stand, which Eloin addressed with patience and Petra addressed with snacks, and Finn addressed by sitting next to him and providing a running commentary on everything happening in the yard, delivered through the window, which Tobin found either comforting or exhausting, depending on his energy level. The 3 days were borrowed time, it turned out. Bram knew it, even while it was happening, the sense that the relative peace was a thing being lent, rather than given, that something larger was still working its way toward them. He'd felt it before. In the particular way a man learns to feel pressure changes in the air when he's spent enough years reading weather. Something was moving. What moved was Ketteridge. The news came through Holt, who rode down from his place on a Thursday morning, with his hat in his hand, and the look of someone delivering something they'd rather not deliver. Ketteridge had been to see Adler. Not an approach, not a prospect. Ketteridge had gone up to that rocky north parcel with papers and a price, and his particular brand of pressure, which was the kind of pressure that doesn't threaten outright, but makes the alternative to agreement seem very cold and very lonely. Adler had not sold, but he was shaken. Holt said he'd ridden past Adler's place and stopped to water his horse. And Adler had come out looking like a man who'd been sleeping badly, and when Holt asked him plain what was wrong, Adler had told him about the visit. He told Adler his water claim was improperly filed, Holt said. Said there were technical errors in the original documents. Said if Adler didn't correct them through Ketteridge's own land agent, his agent, mind you, the county could nullify the claim. Bram felt the cold move through him. Is that true? About the filing? Adler doesn't know, that's the problem. He's not a lawyer, and he doesn't know water law, and Ketteridge knows he doesn't know. So Ketteridge creates doubt, Bram said. Makes Adler think he needs Ketteridge's help to protect what he already has. And if Adler uses Ketteridge's agent to correct the filing gets corrected right into Ketteridge's name, Bram finished. He stood up from the table. When did this happen? Tuesday. So Adler has been sitting with this for 2 days. He looked about 2 days' worth of worried when I saw him, Holt said. Bram went to get his hat. Eloin was in the doorway of the kitchen, where she'd been standing since Holt started talking. Don't go today, she said. He stopped. Why? Not because of the situation you need to go, I know that. Go tomorrow morning early. She came forward and lowered her voice slightly. Not because Holt couldn't hear he could, and she knew it, but because she was talking to Bram now, not the room. If you ride up there today, angry and fast, you'll come in like a threat. Adler's already scared. 2 men pressing at him from different directions won't help. Go tomorrow, come early, and bring the paperwork. What paperwork? The agreement we drafted. The one Silas and I wrote out last month when you shook hands with Adler. We made it clean and specific. She met his eyes. Put it in front of him in writing and let him remember what he agreed to and why. That's more powerful than urgency. Holt looked from one of them to the other, with the expression of a man watching something that he finds both impressive and slightly foreign. Bram put his hat back on the hook. Tomorrow morning, he said. Early, she said. I heard you the first time, he said. Eloin almost smiled. She went back to the kitchen. Holt cleared his throat. Well, he said, that settled then. The morning Bram rode north to Adler's place. The sky was the particular clear blue of early Colorado fall, a color that had no sympathy in it, just light and distance, and the clean, cold smell of elevation. He left before dawn with the agreement papers in his saddlebag and arrived at Adler's just as the sun was clearing the ridge. Adler was already up and outside, which told Bram that the man hadn't been sleeping well. He looked at Bram coming through the gate, and something in his face moved. Not quite relief, not quite wariness, but somewhere between them. I figured you'd be coming, Adler said. Holt told me. I figured that too. He rubbed the back of his neck. Come in. The cabin was simple and not quite finished. In several places, there was a wall that still showed bare studs where paneling hadn't been put up, and the window on the east side was covered with canvas rather than glass. Adler poured coffee that was stronger than it needed to be and sat across from Bram at a table that wobbled slightly. He said the filing was wrong, Adler said. He didn't want to say Ketteridge's name, Bram noticed, as if saying it would make the pressure feel more real. Said the description of the water boundary was imprecise and that the county had flagged it. Has the county actually contacted you about it? Adler looked at his cup. No. Then there is no flag. Ketteridge is telling you there might be a problem so that you'll come to him to fix a problem that doesn't exist. But what if it does exist? Then we find a real lawyer to look at it. Bram pulled the agreement from his saddlebag and put it on the table. This is what we agreed to. You remember? Adler looked at the paper. Yeah. In that agreement, I have an obligation to help you with this land. That includes defending the water claim if it gets challenged. That's written in there. You're not alone in this. Adler was quiet for a moment. He was 25, and this was genuinely harder than he'd expected. And the difficulty was written plainly on him, in the way that difficulty writes itself on people who haven't yet learned to hide it. He offered me more for the parcel than it's worth, Adler said. I know he did. It's a real number, Voss. Yes, Bram said. It is. And the day after you take it, Ketteridge controls the water on Cinder Creek, and everything downstream suffers and eventually fails, including any neighbor you might need in the future. He paused. I can't match that number. I won't pretend I can. What I can do is what's written there. Help you make this land produce what you came up here to make it produce. Keep your claim intact and stand between you and Ketteridge when he comes back. And he will come back. Adler turned his coffee cup in his hands. The wobble in the table made the cup shift slightly with each turn. He's going to come back regardless, Adler said. Yes. And if he pushes harder, then we push back together. That's what neighbors do. Bram leaned forward slightly. The agreement stands at. That's your answer to him the claim is spoken for. It has a formal arrangement attached to it. Your lawyer get a real one. I'll give you a name will confirm the filing is clean. That's the end of his angle. Adler looked at the paper for a long time. He was running the numbers in his head, and the fear in a different column, and trying to see which side was heavier. Okay, he said finally. The claim stays. I'll get the lawyer. Bram nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and drank. The coffee was too strong, but he didn't say so. What's the lawyer's name? Adler said. Bram told him. It was a name Eloin had given him. She'd asked Clara Fennell, who'd done business with the man. And Clara had said he was thorough and honest and charged a fair price, which was all you could reasonably ask. He rode back to Cinder Creek in the full morning light, and when he came through the gate, Eloin was in the yard with a bucket, and she looked up and read his face. He's staying, she said. Not a question. For now, Bram said. He's going to be tempted again. Ketteridge isn't done. No, she said. He's not. She went back to the bucket. Bram unsaddled Cutter and turned him out and stood for a moment at the fence rail looking at the creek, which was running low enough that he could see the stones on the bottom clearly. The stones had been underwater all his years here, and now they were just visible, exposed, the way things are when what covers them is thinning. He turned away from the creek and went back toward the house. The sickness came for Tobin again on a Wednesday, and for a terrible half-day Bram thought it was the same fever returning. But it wasn't. This time it was worse. It had been just over 2 weeks since Tobin's first bout. The boy had recovered fully, or had seemed to. He'd been back to his normal self, chaotic, well-intentioned, in the wrong place at the right time. He'd helped Bram replace a section of water pipe and managed to drop the wrench into the trench twice, and had not been discouraged by this at all. He'd reorganized the firewood pile in a way that made it slightly less organized than before. He tried to teach Finn how to whistle, which had resulted in 45 minutes of wet air sounds and eventual mutual frustration. He was in short Tobin, and then on a Wednesday morning he wasn't. He came to breakfast and said his head hurt, and his legs felt wrong and sat down hard in his chair, and Eloin looked at him across the table and put her hand on his forehead, and the look that moved across her face was the look of someone who recognizes a thing they were hoping not to recognize. This fever was higher than the last one, and it came in faster. Within 2 hours, Tobin was incoherent enough that he didn't know what room he was in, and within 4 hours the willow bark tea made no dent in it, and Eloin came out of the sleeping area and looked at Bram and said, "Go." He was already moving. "Dr. Haskell," she said, "Harwick. 15 miles. I know where Harwick is." "Fast, Bram." "I know." He saddled Cutter in 4 minutes and was through the gate in 5, and he pushed Cutter as hard as was fair for the first 3 miles, and then eased off because a blown horse 15 miles from help was no help at all. and he rode the balance of it at a hard, steady pace with the particular focus of a man who has reduced everything down to one number 15 miles and is making that number smaller as fast as he can. Harwick was a town of maybe 300 people and a main street that justified the name only technically. Haskell's office was above the hardware store and the man was in, which was the first piece of luck Bram had had all morning. He explained the symptoms in the doorway while Haskell was already reaching for his bag. "How high?" Haskell said. "High enough that he didn't know where he was." "How long since onset, since this morning?" "He had a similar fever 2 weeks ago that broke overnight." "Did the earlier one have any accompanying symptoms?" "Rash, stiffness?" Bram thought. His neck was stiff. His mother mentioned it, but we thought it was from sleeping poorly. Haskell looked at him steadily for a moment. Something moved in the doctor's face that Bram didn't like the look of. "I need to ride out there now," Haskell said. "I know. That's why I came." "I mean now," Haskell said, and the word had a weight to it that Bram felt in the center of his chest. They rode back faster than Bram had ridden out, Haskell on his own horse alongside, and Bram did not ask the doctor to explain what he thought it was, because he wasn't sure he wanted to know before they got there, and because knowing would not make the horse faster. The conversation was brief and factual. "He's 6? Haskell said. "Yes, otherwise healthy, prior to this?" "Yes, strong boy, generally." "The ranch water supply, where does it come from?" "Creek upstream and a well tested recently?" "Not formally." "Water looks clean, tastes clean." "That's not the same thing," Haskell said. "No," Bram said, "I know." They covered the last 2 miles without talking, and came through the gate of Cinder Creek at a pace that brought Eloin out of the house before they'd dismounted, with the particular speed of someone who has been listening for hoofbeats. She looked at Haskell and stepped back from the door. He went in. Bram went in behind him. He let the doctor work. He stood outside the sleeping area and listened and kept the other children back. Silas had them in the yard doing something that was probably unnecessary, but was keeping them occupied, which was Silas's quiet genius, the ability to see what was needed and create it without being asked. After 20 minutes, Haskell came out. "It's bacterial," he said. "He's young, and he was strong going in. That's the best thing I can tell you. I've seen this break the right way more than the wrong way in children his age." He opened his bag. "I have medication that should help, but I need you to understand the next 12 hours are what determines things." "What do you need from us?" Eloin said. Her voice was exactly level. "Keep him cool, keep fluids in him, give him this every 4 hours." He put a bottle on the table. "Don't skip a dose. Don't let him sleep longer than 4 hours without waking him for it." "All night," Bram said. "All night," Eloin nodded. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was holding them still by choice. Haskell looked at her. "You've managed fever care before." "Yes." "Then you know what you're looking for. If his breathing changes shallow significantly, or becomes labored, ride for me again immediately. Otherwise, stay the course." He stayed another 30 minutes, checking Tobin again, talking to Eloin in the low specific language of medical instruction, and then he rode back toward Harwick, and the house was very quiet with him gone. Bram stood at the kitchen table, and Eloin stood across from him, and neither of them said the things that were in the room with them. "We'll do 4-hour shifts," she said. "Yes, I'll take the first one." "No," Bram said. "I'll take the first one. You've been here all day. Sleep while you can." She looked at him. She was going to argue. He could see it, and he waited. 4 hours, she said. 4 hours, he agreed. What happened in the night was not something Bram could have told anyone coherently afterward. It existed in the way that certain experiences exist, in fragments, in impressions, in the specific detail that lodges in the memory, because it was too vivid to average out with the rest. He remembered the lamp throwing yellow light against the low ceiling. He remembered the sound of Tobin's breathing, which he'd learned to read in the previous weeks of lesser illness, and was now reading like a text in a language he hadn't chosen to learn. He remembered giving the medicine the way the boy was half awake enough to swallow, not aware enough to complain about the taste, which was the inverse of the usual Tobin experience, and wrong in a way that was hard to put words to. He remembered, at about 2 a.m, that Tobin opened his eyes clearly for the first time in hours, and said, "Bram," with the simple directness of a child who has found what they were looking for in the dark. "Right here," Bram said. Tobin's eyes closed again. That was the moment, if there was a single moment, when Bram understood something he'd been approaching from multiple directions for 8 weeks. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, and whatever it was going to become, he was not going to walk back from it. He didn't know how to characterize it, and he didn't particularly need to. It was simply true the way true things are true, without requiring explanation or ceremony. At 4 a.m, he woke Eloin, who was out of the loft before he'd finished saying her name, and went to the other side of the house and lay down for 4 hours that felt like 40 minutes. When he woke, Eloin was standing in the doorway. "The fever broke," she said. He sat up. "About an hour ago, she was holding the empty lamp." She looked not relieved, because relief was a feeling you had after the danger was fully past, and she wasn't there yet, but lighter. As if something that had been pressing on her had released just enough that she could breathe at full depth again. He's sleeping normally, his color is better. Bram put his boots on. He went in and looked at Tobin, who was asleep on his side with his mouth slightly open and his breathing slow and deep and ordinary. He stood there for longer than was necessary. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window and watched the morning come in, which was what September mornings did at that altitude. They arrived cleanly, without apology, as if the night's difficulty was nobody's business but the night's. It was Silas who collapsed on the following Friday, which was so unexpected that Bram didn't register it immediately as what it was. He was coming around the side of the barn, and Silas was there ahead of him, supposed to be checking the harness, and he was on his knees in the dirt, with his hands braced and his head down. And Bram's first instinct was that the boy had dropped something and was picking it up. Then he got closer. Silas's hands were shaking. His face, when he turned it up, was the gray color of something unwell, and his eyes were wrong in the way eyes go wrong when the person behind them has pushed past what the body will allow. "Silas, I'm fine," Silas said. He tried to stand and couldn't and went back to his hands. "Give me a minute." Bram crouched down. "How long have you been like this?" "I'm not Silas." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "How long?" The shoulder was thinner than it should have been. Bram noticed that now and felt something that he recognized as the particular guilt of someone who has been looking at a thing without seeing it. "I've been tired," Silas said. He said it the way he said everything, flat, honest, with no self-pity in it, which made it worse somehow. "I didn't want to say anything because there was too much." "How long?" Silas let out a breath. "About a week. Since Tobin got bad, a week." Bram did the arithmetic. A week of Silas running the full ranch chores without telling anyone he wasn't right. Because Tobin was sick, and his mother was needed inside, and Bram was running between the house and the barn and the creek, and nobody had been watching the 13-year-old, who had been quietly doing more than anyone had asked him to do. "Can you stand?" Bram said. "Yes." He tried again, and this time made it, though he swayed enough that Bram's hand went to his elbow without thought. "Come on," Bram said. He walked Silas back toward the house, and here was the part that lodged in his memory the way the significant details lodge, permanent and specific. About halfway across the yard, Silas's legs simply stopped working with any reliability, and Bram caught him, and the boy was too exhausted to be embarrassed about it, and Bram adjusted his grip and half-carried him the remaining distance. It was not far, maybe 200 yards. In the heat of a September Friday afternoon, it felt longer. Eloin opened the door before they reached it. She looked at Silas's face and stepped aside and did not say anything yet, which was discipline, because what her face was doing was not neutral. They got him inside and onto the cot that had been Tobin's 2 days prior, and Eloin checked him with the same efficient focus she applied to all medical situations, which was the focus of someone who has never had the luxury of falling apart. "He's exhausted," she said. "Seriously exhausted, and dehydrated. He's been running everything for a week," Bram said. She looked at him. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said it, the recognition of something they'd both missed, both being too consumed with Tobin to see it, and neither of them were going to feel good about that. "He needs to eat and sleep and drink water," she said. "And he's not to work for at least 3 days. I'll tell him," Bram said. "He won't listen to me about it," she said. "He never does. Tell him it's your order about the ranch. Something that has to do with work." Bram looked at her. "You're asking me to lie to your son." "I'm asking you to make resting sound like duty," she said. "It's not the same thing, and Silas understands duty." Bram sat down beside Silas, and the boy opened his eyes. "Here's what I need you to do," Bram said. "I need you to rest for 3 days because I can't have you out on the range in this condition. Too risky, you understand? This isn't about being sick. This is about not being a liability." Silas looked at him for a long moment. He was 13 and not foolish. "Okay," he said. "Good." Bram stood up. "When you're better, I'll show you the section on the creek bank that needs shoring before winter. I need someone who knows what they're looking at for that." "Okay," Silas said again. And this time something in his face relaxed the particular release of a boy who has been holding himself responsible for everything and has been given permission, framed correctly, to let it go. Bram went outside. He stood in the yard in the afternoon heat and looked at the creek, the garden, the barn with its new roof sections, the fence lines running north and south, the 2 homes his, and the structure they'd been slowly building as an outbuilding, which had begun to take on the character of something more permanent. He looked at all of it and felt, for the first time in the 9 weeks since he'd gone down into that ravine, something close to overwhelmed. Not in defeat, that wasn't it. It was the overwhelm of someone who has been moving so fast through necessity that they haven't had a moment to turn around and look at the full weight of what they've been carrying, and when they finally do, It's heavier than they'd acknowledged, and lighter too in some strange way, because part of the weight is not theirs alone anymore. He was standing there when he heard Eloin behind him. She came to stand beside him, not quite beside a foot of space between them, and looked at the same things he was looking at. He'll be all right, she said. About Silas, I know. You got him inside before he fell, she said. That matters. Bram looked at the creek. I should have noticed a week ago. I should have noticed too, she said. I didn't. She paused. We can't see everything, no. We can only see what we see and do better when we see more. She looked at the garden, the fence, the barn. That's all anyone can do. Bram stood there, with the afternoon sun going sideways and the creek running low and everything, all of it, the debt and the water and Ketteridge and the children and the fence and the well and the turning season pressing in at the edges, the way it always pressed, the way it had been pressing since long before a woman with a hatchet had lowered it slowly in a ravine because she'd decided, against reasonable evidence, that he could be trusted. He didn't say any of that. The Holts sent a message, he said. They want to know if we need anything. Eloin was quiet for a moment. Tell them yes, she said. Bram looked at her. That was the first time she had said that, the first time she'd answered that particular question with anything other than we're fine or we'll manage. Yes, he said. Yes, she said again, quieter. As if the word was something she was getting used to saying, Bram turned toward the house. I'll write to them this evening. Good, she said. He went back inside, and the house received him the way it had been receiving him for 9 weeks, with the particular noise and aliveness of a place that had more people in it than it was built for, and that had become, for exactly that reason, something that it hadn't been before. The letter from the Holts arrived the same week that Silas got back on his feet, and it contained not just an offer of help but a list of specific things the Holt family could provide: 2 days of labor from their oldest boy and his cousin, a load of timber they had surplus from a collapsed outbuilding, and a standing invitation to share Sunday meals until the season turned. Eloin read the letter at the table and folded it carefully and set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. Clara Fennell sent word too, Bram said. She's coming Thursday with her girls to help with the canning. Eloin looked at the folded letter. You wrote to them. I wrote to the Holts. Clara heard from someone else. I don't know who word moves, Eloin said. It does. She picked up the letter again and read it a second time, which was not something she did with things that didn't merit it. Then she set it back down and stood up and went back to the stove, and Bram understood that she was not going to say what the letter had meant to her, but that it had meant something, and that was sufficient. The community that had begun to form around Cinder Creek in September accelerated in October with the particular momentum that communities develop when enough individual decisions have been made to align in the same direction. It was not organized. Nobody appointed a leader or sets a schedule. It was simply that people began appearing the Holt boy on Tuesday mornings, Clara Fennell and her daughters when Eloin was doing major canning, a man named Pruitt from 4 miles east who showed up one Saturday with a post-hole digger and spent 6 hours on the west fence without explaining why he'd come and without being asked to explain. Bram thanked him. Pruitt said, Ketteridge bought out the Alderman place last spring. You know that, I heard. Alderman needed the money. Ketteridge knew he needed it. Pruitt worked the digger down another foot. There are people in this county who are watching what you do out here, Voss, whether you hold. Bram looked at the fence line. I'm holding. I can see that, Pruitt said, and went back to digging. That was the nature of it, not declarations, not speeches. Just the steady accumulation of people who understood what Ketteridge's expansion meant for the smaller operations around him, and had decided, in their individual ways, that Cinder Creek was worth the investment of a Tuesday morning or 6 hours with a post-hole digger. Eloin understood this better than Bram did, or understood it faster. She had a sense for the social architecture of things that he lacked: how groups formed, what held them, what dissolved them. She made sure that every person who came to help left with something: a jar from the pantry shelf, a piece of mending done, a meal if the timing worked. Not as payment, as acknowledgement. The difference mattered to her, and she explained it to Bram once in terms he kept afterward. Payment says the transaction is finished. Acknowledgement says it's ongoing. The acknowledgement kept people coming back. Silas returned to work on a Thursday, 3 days after Bram had told him to rest, which was exactly when Bram had expected him to return regardless of what he'd been told. He came out in the morning with his boots on before Bram had finished his coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression of a boy who is done being a patient and is ready to argue about it if necessary. Bram looked at him. Creek Bank section, he said. I'll show you this morning. Silas nodded and came in for coffee, and the argument that had been ready didn't need to happen. The Creek Bank section was a real problem, a 20-foot stretch on the north edge of the property, where the bank had been undermining for 2 seasons, and would eventually take a chunk of the adjacent pasture with it if it wasn't shored properly. Bram had been meaning to address it for a year. He'd had the knowledge, but not the time. And now with Silas, he had someone who could learn the technique and carry the work forward. They spent the morning at it. Bram showed him how to read the erosion pattern where the water was cutting, how fast, what the bank's composition was, and what that meant for what kind of reinforcement would hold. Silas listened the way he always listened, which was completely, with no performance of listening, and no questions until he'd absorbed the whole picture. Then he asked 3 questions in a row that were exactly the right questions. Bram answered them and went back to work. After a while, Silas said, "She worries about you." Bram looked up from the stake he was driving. "Your mother?" "When you rode for Haskell. For Tobin." He was looking at the bank rather than at Bram. "She didn't say anything while you were gone. She just worked. But I watched her." He paused. "She watches the road." Bram drove the stake the rest of the way in. "She watches it the right direction too," Silas added. "North, toward Harwick, not any other direction." Bram picked up the next stake. "You're 13, he said. "I know how old I am. And you're telling me this because she won't." Silas finally looked at him. He had his mother's eyes and his mother's directness, and none of the diplomatic softening that some people put between a fact and the saying of it. She doesn't tell people things that make her seem like she needs something. You know that. Bram did know that. And you think she needs something. "I think she already has it," Silas said. "I just don't know if you know that." He went back to the bank work and didn't bring it up again, and Bram drove stakes and thought about what the boy had said with the focused avoidance of someone who knows he'll come back to it later and is not ready to come back to it yet. October settled into its rhythms, and the rhythms were good ones mostly. And then on a Monday morning the second week of October, a man rode up to the gate of Cinder Creek whom Bram had never seen before. He was average in every visible way, average height, average coat, a horse that was competent rather than notable, and he had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who is paid to deliver unpleasant things and has learned not to take the reaction personally. He asked for Eloin Harrow by that name. Bram heard it from the porch and went still. Eloin came out from inside and looked at the man. "Mrs. Harrow," the man said. He wasn't a lawman, no badge, no air of authority. Something between a clerk and a courier. "I'm serving notice on behalf of creditors, acting on obligations of Calvert Harrow, formerly of Pueblo. The notice pertains to property claim." He held out an envelope. Eloin took it. She did not open it immediately. She looked at the man. "Property claim on what property?" "On any property or assets held in the name Harrow, ma'am, arising from debts incurred by your husband prior to your separation." "My husband abandoned me and 5 children in Pueblo 4 months ago," Eloin said. Her voice was flat and entirely steady. "Yes, ma'am. The notice addresses that. You'll want to have someone look at the legal language." He tipped his hat and rode back out. Bram watched Eloin stand at the gate with the envelope in her hand. He watched her not open it for a full 30 seconds, which was long for her. Then she opened it. She read it twice, which she only did with things that required it. Then she came up the porch steps and handed it to Bram without a word and went inside. Bram read it. Calvert Harrow had debts. Several of them, and not small ones, a merchant debt in Pueblo, a land note he'd defaulted on, a personal obligation to someone identified only by initials. His creditors, unable to collect from Calvert directly because Calvert appeared to have made himself scarce, had identified Eloin as a legal wife and were claiming any marital assets in her possession which, under certain readings of Colorado territorial law, could include her share of a property arrangement she'd entered into at Cinder Creek. The filing was creative. Bram had to give whoever had drafted it some credit for creativity. It didn't have an obvious legal leg to stand on, but it didn't need to have an obvious leg to stand on. It needed to create enough uncertainty and legal cost to make Eloin capitulate and produce whatever assets she had, which were not many but were something. He read it a 3rd time. Then he went inside. Eloin was at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, looking at the grain of the wood. "He knew where I was," she said, apparently. Or his creditors did. "They're more organized than he is." She looked up. "I have $31 in my own name. The sewing income, what I haven't put into the household. That's all I have that could be called mine outright." "They're not after $31, Bram said. "They're after whatever they can establish as marital property. If you have a formal arrangement here, which I do, they might argue it gives Calvert a claim by extension." He sat down. "It's not a strong argument, but it would cost money to fight." Eloin looked at him. There was something in her face he hadn't seen before, not fear, exactly, and not anger, but underneath both of those, something older and harder, the residue of someone who has been let down by the formal world enough times to have stopped being surprised when it produces another version of the same thing. "He's not here," she said, "but he can still take from us." Bram set the notice on the table. "No," he said. "No," he said again. "Not if I can help it." She looked at the notice. "A lawyer costs money we don't have a surplus of, and if we fight it and lose, I know the risks." He picked the notice up. Let me think about it tonight. She was quiet. He could see her running the same calculations he was running, from her side of the table, and reaching the same conclusions he was reaching, which was that the options were limited, and none of them were free. All right, she said, tonight. He didn't sleep much. He lay in the loft and looked at the ceiling and went through it from multiple angles. The way you work a stuck problem, looking for the direction that moves. The issue was not the legal argument. The legal argument, from what he understood of it and from what he'd seen in the notice, was weak. Eloin had been abandoned, not separated by mutual agreement, and Colorado had provisions that addressed abandonment situations. A competent lawyer would find them. The issue was time and money. Filing a response, retaining counsel, appearing in whatever county this notice originated in at all cost, and it cost up front. And the creditors knew that. They weren't expecting to win in court. They were expecting Eloin to look at the cost of fighting and decide that $31 was cheaper to hand over than legal fees. Bram got up at about 3 in the morning and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark and thought about the tin under the bed. He'd rebuilt the reserve since the note payment. He had, as of that week, $112 in the tin. That was more than he'd had in 2 years. It represented the sold steer. Eloin's sewing income contributed to household expenses, freeing up his operational money, and 3 months of tighter management than he'd been practicing before she arrived. $112. A lawyer to fight a property claim, file responses, potentially appear at a hearing he'd need to ask, but his estimate was $80 to $100 minimum. That would leave him with $12 to $32 going into winter. Enough to survive, not enough to manage comfortably. And if anything else went wrong, another illness, a fence failure, he'd be in the kind of trouble that didn't stay manageable. He sat in the dark and looked at that calculation for a long time. Then he thought about Tobin saying his name in the dark at 2 in the morning. He thought about Silas at the creek bank, asking the right questions. He thought about Finn calling the post crooked and being right. He thought about Petra running the morning lessons, and Bea with her total seriousness about small tasks, and the way Eloin stood at the gate with an envelope she hadn't opened yet because she already knew it, was bad and was preparing herself to read it anyway. He went back to bed. He had his answer. He'd had it before he got up, if he was honest about it. In the morning, he told Eloin what he was going to do. She said, "That's almost everything we have." "I know." "Bram, if something else." "I know," he said. "We manage what comes." She looked at him across the table. She was trying to find the argument, and he could see her finding it, and then setting it aside, which was its own kind of thing, a woman who always had the better plan, choosing to let someone else's plan stand. "All right," she said. "There's something else," he said. "The arrangement we have, it's informal, which is what gave them the angle in the first place." He paused. "I want to make it formal. A legal partnership. Equal shares, both names on the deed amendment. If for full partners under law, Calvert's claim has no surface to attach to, because your assets aren't separate assets anymore, they're partnership assets. And a spouse's creditors can't reach a business partner's holdings for one partner's personal debt." Eloin was very still. "It also means," Bram said, "that if something happens to me, the ranch doesn't go to whoever is next in line by default. It stays with the partnership. With you and the children. You've thought about this for a while," she said. "I thought about most of it last night. Some of it I've been thinking about for longer." He turned his cup in his hands. "I'm not saying it to..." He stopped. Started again. "It's a practical solution to a legal problem. That's the reason I'm proposing it." Eloin looked at him. Her eyes were clear and direct, and she was reading him the way she read everything carefully, without hurry, looking for what was actually being said, underneath what was being said. "I know it is," she said, "and I know it isn't only that." Bram didn't say anything. "Yes," she said, "let's make it formal." He went to Cartwright that afternoon and sat with a lawyer named Gaffney, who had been recommended by the same network that had produced Haskell and the water law referral, which was a network that Bram was increasingly grateful for, and increasingly understood was largely Eloin's construction. Gaffney was a careful man in his 50s who read the notice twice with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and then set it down and looked at Bram over the glasses. "This is what we call a pressure filing," he said. "It's real enough to require a response, but it's not built to withstand one. Whoever drafted it was counting on the target to either not respond or respond without counsel. Can it reach the ranch property? Not if the property is held in genuine partnership predating the filing. We'd need to document the partnership as established before this notice was served, which it was, in practical terms, even if not yet in legal terms." Gaffney tapped the notice. "When did the working arrangement begin?" Bram told him the day he'd brought Eloin and the children to the ranch. 4 months ago, Gaffney said. "Good. We established the partnership formally now. Document it as the formalization of an ongoing arrangement. File the response to the creditors, citing the partnership structure, and the claim has nowhere to go." He looked at Bram. There's also an abandonment argument. Your Mrs. Harrow was abandoned. Colorado territorial law has provisions for a wife abandoned without support. Calvert Harrow left his wife and 5 minor children without provision in a city 8 miles from the state line. That's not a gray area. Can we pursue that as well? We can include it in the response as a counter to any assertion of marital asset rights. Effectively, the marriage produced abandonment, not community property, and the injured party is not required to service the abandoning party's debts. Gaffney took his glasses off. It'll cost you, Bram told him what he had available. Gaffney did a brief internal calculation. It's workable. Not comfortable, but workable. I'll need half now and half when the response is filed and accepted. Bram paid the first half. He rode home with less money than he'd ridden out with, and the particular lightness of someone who has made an irreversible choice and found that the irreversibility is part of what makes it feel right. The response was filed inside 10 days. Gaffney was methodical, and the documentation he assembled was thorough. The partnership agreement, signed by both Bram and Eloin before a county notary, the record of the working arrangement at Cinder Creek with witnesses attesting to its existence since June, and the abandonment filing that Gaffney had constructed with the specificity of someone who enjoyed building an airtight case. The creditor's representative sent one follow-up inquiry. Gaffney responded to it with a letter that was 4 pages long and completely unanswerable on the legal points it raised. There was no further contact. Bram learned this on a Wednesday when Gaffney's note arrived, and he read it at the kitchen table with Eloin standing at the stove, and the children doing their various morning things in various states of noise and attention. He handed her the note. She read it. She set it down. She went back to the stove. "That's it," Silas said from the table where he'd been watching. "That's it," Bram said. Silas looked at the note. "All that for that." "Most legal things are like that," Eloin said from the stove. "The threat is larger than what's behind it. The answer is to make what's behind you larger than the threat." Tobin said, "What does that mean?" "It means we won," Petra said, without looking up from her arithmetic. Tobin considered this. "Oh," he said, and went back to his breakfast. Finn, who had been watching from his chair with the focused attention he applied to things he didn't understand but found important, said, "Are we safe now?" The question landed in the room with a weight that was slightly out of proportion to its 6 words. Bram looked at Eloin's back. She had gone still at the stove in the particular way she went still when she was deciding something. She turned around. "Yes," she said. She looked at Finn directly the way she always looked at him when she wanted him to believe something fully. "We're safe." Finn accepted this and went back to his eggs. The morning continued. Dishes were washed. The children dispersed to their various tasks and lessons. Bram took his coffee to the porch and stood looking at the creek, which was still low, but had picked up a little in the October rains, not back to normal, but moving in the right direction. Eloin came out and stood beside him. "The deed amendment," she said. "When does Gaffney file it?" "It's already filed. Went in with the partnership documentation." "So it's done, it's done." She was quiet for a moment. Below in the yard, Finn was following Silas toward the barn, trying to match his stride, which required a small skipping step every few paces to keep up. Silas slowed down without appearing to slow down, which was characteristic of him. "When Calvert left us in Pueblo," Eloin said, "I told myself that we didn't need anyone. I'd build something for them on my own." She was looking at the yard. "I believed it when I said it. I had to believe it." Bram waited. "I don't believe it anymore," she said. "Not because I couldn't, I think I could, but because it's not the point." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "The point is that they have this, all of it, what it is now." Bram looked at the yard, at Silas and Finn heading into the barn, at Petra coming around the side of the house with the chicken bucket, at the sound of Tobin and Bia arguing cheerfully about something from inside. "Yeah," he said. They stood there with their coffee and the October morning and the creek running below them, and after a while Eloin went back inside, and Bram stayed on the porch a little longer, looking at the property, his property, their property, the deed now corrected to say so, and thinking about the gap between what a place is and what it can become, and how you can't always see the distance until you're already partway across it. Ketteridge came back the last week of October. He didn't come with a price this time. He came with a county assessor's map, spread across his saddle, and a man from the land office in tow, and he stopped at Bram's gate and called out in the same tone as before, not loud, not hostile, the tone of a man who is still working through moves and hasn't run out yet. Bram went out to meet him. He did not invite him in. "New survey," Ketteridge said. He tapped the map. "County's been updating the assessments. Interesting thing came up about the original Cinder Creek boundary description." "Interesting how?" Bram said. "Old descriptions references a creek marker that shifted in the floods of '81. If the marker shifted, the legal boundary of your property shifted with it, which would put your upstream water access claim outside your deeded property line." Bram looked at the map. He did not touch it. "That's your reading of it." It's the county assessor's reading, Ketteridge said, with a small gesture toward the man from the land office, who had the expression of someone who had been brought along to look official and was hoping that was all that would be required of him. I'd want my own survey, Bram said. That's your right, Ketteridge said. Of course, while you're getting that sorted, your water access claim is technically in question, which means nothing while it's in question, Bram said. A claim in question isn't a claim denied. I'm not doing anything differently while my own survey is pending. Ketteridge looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite admiration and not quite irritation, closer to the recalibration of a man who has made an estimate and is revising it upward. You've gotten sharper, Voss, he said. I have good counsel, Bram said. The Harrow woman. It wasn't a question. Bram looked at him steadily. My partner, he said. Her name is on the deed. Something shifted in Ketteridge's face. Not the recalibration this time, something colder, more final. A man who has found the edge of a territory he wasn't expecting. I see, Ketteridge said. I imagine you do. Ketteridge rolled the map. He handed it back to the land office man without looking at him. He looked at the property, the barn with its repaired roof, the fence lines running clean, the garden stripped now but clearly productive, the children's voices coming from somewhere out of sight. You've built something, he said. It was the most neutral thing he'd ever said at Bram's gate, and for that reason it was possibly the most honest. Yes, Bram said. Ketteridge turned his horse. He didn't say he was giving up. He didn't say anything further. He rode back out through the gate with his land office man behind him, and Bram stood and watched them go until the horses were small on the road north, and then he turned back toward the house. The survey question was real and would need addressing. Gaffney would know who to hire. It would cost something, which things always did, and they would manage it the way they'd been managing everything, one problem at a time, in the order the problems arrived, without waiting to have more than they had before they started. He went back up the porch steps and through the door and into the house that had become, somewhere between June and October, without ceremony or announcement, the place where all of them were from. Eloin was at the table with the account book she'd started keeping in August. Every expenditure, every income, every transaction, the record of what Cinder Creek was and what it was becoming. She looked up when he came in. Ketteridge, she said. New angle, he said. Survey question. I'll write to Gaffney. She looked at him for a moment, reading his face the way she read everything. He's running out of angles, she said. Getting close, Bram said. Good, she said, and went back to the accounts. Tobin appeared from the sleeping area with a piece of wood he'd been working on with Silas's knife, shaping it into something that was possibly a horse and possibly a dog and possibly something entirely original. What did that man want, he said. Same thing he always wants, Bram said. Did he get it? No. Tobin looked at the wood in his hand. Good, he said. He's with the simple satisfaction of someone for whom the right answer is the right answer and doesn't require elaboration. Go find Silas, Bram said. I need both of you at the creek bank before the light goes. Tobin went. Bram poured himself a cup of what was left in the pot, which was cold and too strong and exactly what he had, and drank it standing at the window, watching the late October light move across the yard of Cinder Creek Ranch, which was whatever else it was or wasn't still standing. Gaffney's surveyor came out the first week of November, a lean, quiet man named Crossfield, who carried his instruments the way some men carry tools they've worked with. So long the tools have become an extension of how they think. He spent 2 days on the property walking the boundary lines, checking the creek markers, measuring and noting, and saying very little to anyone except occasional technical observations to himself that he wrote in a small book without sharing their contents. Bram followed him on the first day because it was his land, and he wanted to understand what was being measured and why. Eloin sent Silas on the second day with instructions to watch carefully and remember what he saw, which Silas did with the focused attention that was his particular gift. Crossfield came to the kitchen table on the evening of the second day and spread his own map beside the county map Ketteridge had brought, and he explained what he'd found in the plain, unhurried language of a man who has no stake in the outcome and therefore no reason to dress it up. The creek marker question was real. There had been a flood in 1881, and a marker stone had moved. That part was accurate. But what Ketteridge's reading of it had omitted, whether by ignorance or design, was that the original deed description used the marker as a secondary reference, not a primary one. The primary boundary reference was a ridgeline to the northwest that had not moved and could not move, and measured from that fixed point, the Cinder Creek property boundary fell exactly where it had always fallen, upstream water access intact. Crossfield showed them on the map. He circled the relevant notation in the original deed with a pencil. The marker question is a distraction, he said, or an error. I can't tell you which. Bram could tell which, but he didn't say so. How long to file the corrected survey? Eloin asked. 2 weeks once I've drafted the formal documentation. Gaffney's office will file it with the county. Crossfield rolled his maps. After that, the boundary description is updated in the county record, and there's nothing to argue about. He left the next morning. Bram paid him from what remained in the tin, which was thin now but present, and Crossfield rode back toward Cartwright in the early gray light, and the Cinder Creek boundary question went with him, on its way to becoming a settled matter. Bram stood at the gate after the surveyor left and looked north up the road that ran toward Adler's parcel, and beyond that toward Ketteridge's operation. The morning was cold in the way November mornings in Colorado were cold, not the worst cold yet. That was still coming, but the kind that reminds you what's on its way and suggests you take it seriously. He took it seriously. He went back inside and told Eloin the timeline, and she wrote it in the account book under the current date. Because she wrote everything in the account book now, every agreement, every transaction, every date that mattered, which was the same instinct that had produced the documentation that beat back Calvert's creditors, and the same instinct that Silas had described to Bram back at the north fence. In August, she kept records. She kept them carefully, and no one had ever beaten her in a dispute where she had records, and they didn't. November came in with its full cold, and the ranch contracted around it the way ranches do in winter, the daily range of movement getting smaller, the work shifting from building and planting to maintaining and preserving, the days shorter and the evenings longer, and the house more present in everyone's life because there was no outdoor light to escape into after supper. 7 people in a house built for one. Bram had never spent a winter with other people. Not since he was young, not since before everything that had come between then and now. He'd forgotten what it was, the particular noise of it, the particular warmth of it, the way a house with people in it holds heat differently than a house that's just shelter. Eloin's sewing moved inside entirely. She'd set up in the corner by the east window, where the light was best, and she worked mornings and sometimes evenings, and the sound of her work, the particular rhythm of it, became part of the house's sound, the way the creek was part of the land's sound. The children expanded to fill winter the way children do, finding the indoor version of everything they'd done outside. Silas had taken to woodworking with a seriousness that had started as a practical necessity and had become something more. He was building things now, not just repairing them. A set of shelves for the kitchen that fit the available wall with a precision that Bram noticed and said nothing about directly, but that he ran his hand along once when he thought no one was watching, checking the joints the way a man checks work he respects. Silas had been watching from the loft and saw him do it and didn't say anything either. Tobin had discovered that he was good at drawing, which surprised everyone, including Tobin. He'd started by drawing the animals post the steer with his black and white markings, rendered on the back of an old receipt in a way that was technically rough but recognizably post, which was more than most people could have managed. He moved on to the buildings, the people, the creek. He drew Finn asleep on the blanket by the wall, and the result was accurate enough that Eloin stopped what she was doing and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Keep doing that," she told Tobin. He kept doing that. Petra continued to be 9 years old in the way that Petra was 9 competent, beyond what 9 should reasonably require, occasionally resentful of it in the way that children resent the roles they've grown into when they'd rather be less responsible and more free, and managing that resentment with the same discipline she managed everything else. Bram caught her once. In a moment she didn't know she was being observed, just sitting on the porch step doing nothing, not watching anything, not organizing anything, just sitting with her chin in her hands and her eyes on the middle distance. He left her alone. Everyone needed the version of rest that looks like doing nothing, and Petra needed it more than most, and she got it less. Bea had decided that winter was her best season. She became a small indoor authority on where things were and where they should be, and she could locate any missing object in the house with a reliability that began to be relied upon, which was the kind of small domestic genius that goes largely unrecognized because it's invisible when it works and only noticed when it isn't. Finn grew. Not dramatically, he was still 4, turning 5 in December, but he filled out the way children fill out when they've been properly fed for long enough, and the anxiety of not enough has been replaced by the simple, ordinary fact of enough. He slept through the night. He asked questions constantly. He had opinions about everything. "That board is crooked," he told Silas one morning, pointing at the new shelves. Silas looked at the board. He'd checked it with a level. "It's not crooked." "It looks crooked," Finn said. "Looks and aren't the same thing." Finn considered this philosophical distinction for a moment. "Okay," he said, not entirely convinced, and moved on to his next observation about the world. The cabin had been started in September as a separate sleeping structure. The main house was too crowded by any reasonable measure, and Bram had laid the foundation when the ground was still workable, and the walls had gone up with the Holt boys' help and Pruitt's timber and 2 other neighbors, who'd appeared on framing day without being formally invited. The way people appear when a building is going up and there is work, their hands know how to do. It wasn't finished by November. It was enclosed walls, roof, windows, but the interior needed work, and winter's arrival had slowed the finishing. Still, it was there, solid on its foundation, and on mild days Silas worked at the interior in the afternoon when the outside temperature climbed enough to make the work tolerable. Eloin did not push on the cabin. She didn't mention it, and she didn't ask about the timeline. Bram understood that she had made a decision, somewhere in the accumulation of months, to stop calculating the exit conditions of her arrangement at Cinder Creek, and start treating it as the arrangement that it was not provisional, not temporary, not contingent on what else might materialize. He understood this partly from what she said and partly from what she stopped saying. She stopped talking about the future in conditional terms. She stopped beginning sentences with "when we're more settled" or "once things stabilize." She talked about spring planting, the way you talk about something you know you're going to be there to do. It was Finn who said it out loud, because Finn always said things out loud that everyone else was managing silently. He was sitting on Bram's knee one evening in the way he'd taken to sitting there, just arriving and installing himself without asking, on the solid assumption that this was an available and acceptable place to be, and he said, "Are we going to stay here?" Bram looked at the top of the boy's head. "Yes," he said. "Forever? That's a long time," Finn thought about it. "A long time is okay," he said. "I like it here." Across the room, Eloin's sewing paused for exactly 2 seconds and then resumed. Silas, at the woodworking bench, kept his eyes on what he was doing, but the set of his shoulders changed in the small, specific way that meant he'd heard and was filing it. "A long time is okay," Bram agreed. The survey was filed and accepted by the county in the 3rd week of November. Gaffney sent word with characteristic efficiency, a brief note confirming the filing date, the updated deed description, and the fact that the county record now reflected the corrected boundary with no outstanding disputes. Bram read the note at breakfast and passed it to Eloin. She read it and passed it back. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. Tobin asked what was done, and Petra told him the land question was settled, and Tobin said good, and went back to his drawing, which was today a portrait of Cutter the horse, with what appeared to be a somewhat philosophical expression. The resolution of the survey question removed the last formal threat against the ranch. Calvert's creditors had gone silent after Gaffney's response. The water access was documented and filed. The boundary was corrected and recorded. The partnership was legal and registered. Ketteridge had no remaining angle that the paper trail didn't already answer. That didn't mean Ketteridge was finished as a presence in the county. He was too established for that and too stubborn, and Bram had no illusion that the man had genuinely changed his views of Cinder Creek or its occupants. But there is a difference between a man who wants something and a man who has run out of ways to get it, and Ketteridge had arrived at that difference. And for the purposes of Cinder Creek, that was what mattered. The day the confirmation arrived, Bram rode up to Adler's parcel to tell him in person. It was the kind of news that deserved a conversation rather than a letter. Adler had changed over the months since Bram had first ridden up to that rocky parcel in August. He was still young, still learning, still navigating the gap between his expectations and what the land actually required of him. But the overwhelmed quality had settled into something more like workable difficulty, which was the natural progression of a person who was paying attention and surviving. The cattle that had been underweight in August were moving through the fall in better condition. The lean-to barn had acquired a more competent second wall. They sat on Adler's porch in the November cold with their coats on, and Bram told him about the survey and the filing and Ketteridge's quiet withdrawal from the water angle. Adler was quiet for a moment. "He'll find another way eventually," he said. "For someone else, if not for us." "Probably," Bram said. "But not this way, not on this property," Adler nodded. He looked out at his land, rocky and imperfect, and not what he'd imagined when he'd come up from Denver, but his, and increasingly known to him in the way land becomes known when you've worked it in all 4 seasons. "The lawyer you sent me to," he said. "Gaffney. He was good." "He was. The cattle rotation you set up, it's working. I'm going to come out of this winter better than I thought." "I told you it would, you did." Adler looked at him. "I didn't entirely believe you, I know," Bram said. "Most people don't until they see it." They shook hands at the gate, and Bram rode back down to Cinder Creek in the afternoon cold. And when he came through his own gate, the smoke was rising from the chimney, and the light was in the windows, and from the barn he could hear Silas and Tobin in some kind of discussion that involved at least one of them being wrong about something, and the other one being willing to point it out at length. He unsaddled Cutter and turned him out, and stood for a moment at the corral fence, just looking at the property in the late light. The barn with its solid roof, the fence lines running true. The garden put to bed under straw for winter, the soil amended and rested and ready for spring. The cabin standing complete on its foundation, the interior almost finished, the windows catching the low sun at an angle that made them look lit from his inside even when they weren't. He thought about June, about coming down that ravine wall toward a woman with a hatchet and a sick child, and no water and no plan beyond the immediate next hour. He thought about what he'd seen from the rim and the calculation he'd made, which had not been a complicated calculation, which had, in fact, been one of the simplest things he'd ever decided, even though the consequences of it had been anything but simple. You see someone in trouble and you go down. The rest of it, the debt and the water and Ketteridge and the legal filings and the fevers and the fence lines and the difficult conversations and the slow hard work of 7 people making something from very little. All of that was what happened after the simple thing. The simple thing was just going down. He went inside. The letter from Ketteridge arrived on a Friday morning in early December, and it was not what any of them expected. It was handwritten, which was the first unusual thing. Ketteridge's previous communications had all been delivered through agents or made in person with a studied informality. This was in his own hand a large, careful script that suggested a man who did not write letters often, and was being deliberate about this one. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the survey resolution and the settled water access question, in language that was formal without being warm. The second was harder to characterize. Ketteridge wrote that he had made errors of judgment in his approach to Cinder Creek over the past several months. He did not elaborate extensively on this, and he did not use the word apology, but the paragraph did the work of one. It named what had been done, acknowledged that it had been wrong, and did not excuse it. The third paragraph was an offer, not to buy the property. An offer of a formal good neighbor agreement, mutual access to certain trails and water points, shared arrangements during branding season, the kind of practical cooperation that adjacent ranches in the Colorado high country needed, and that Ketteridge's campaign against Cinder Creek had made impossible. Bram read it twice. Eloin read it once. "What do you think?" he said. She set the letter down. She was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of silence she had when she was thinking something through that was more complicated than it appeared. "I think he ran the numbers," she said, "not the moral numbers, the practical ones. We're established now, legal partnership, documented water rights, community relationships, Adler's parcel aligned with. Picking a fight with Cinder Creek costs him more than leaving us alone. So it's self-interest. It's almost always self-interest," she said. "That doesn't mean the agreement isn't real or useful. It just means you know what it's based on." She looked at the letter. "A reliable enemy is more useful than a false friend. An honest truce is more useful than either." Bram thought about it. "The good neighbor agreement makes practical sense. Trail access in particular. Yes. And it signals to the rest of the county that the situation has resolved. Which matters for Adler and for anyone else Ketteridge has been circling." She looked at him. "I'd accept it. With Gaffney's review first." Bram nodded. He wrote back that same day a brief formal reply, accepting the principle of the agreement and directing Ketteridge to coordinate terms with Gaffney for the legal language. He did not make it warm, and he did not make it cold, and he did not add anything that wasn't necessary, because unnecessary things in a letter like this created room for misunderstanding. Gaffney reviewed the terms and found them straightforward. The agreement was executed before Christmas, both signatures notarized, 1 copy to each ranch, 1 copy to the county office, where agreements went to be witnessed by the permanence of record. Bram told Eloin when the copy arrived. She said good and went back to what she was doing. He understood that reaction. It wasn't indifference. It was the response of someone who has fought hard for a thing and received it, and has the discipline not to celebrate excessively, because excessive celebration uses energy that's better kept for what comes next. Eloin had always understood that the arrival of one resolution was just the ground on which the next thing would be built. The cabin was finished the second week of December. Silas put in the last interior board himself, a piece of planking along the north wall that he'd been working on for 2 weeks, and that fit its space with the kind of precision that comes not from luck, but from measuring 3 times before cutting once. He didn't announce when it was done. He came inside the main house and told his mother the interior was complete. Eloin went to look. She walked through the cabin slowly, touching the shelves Silas had built in, checking the window latches, looking at the floor he'd swept clean, and the small iron stove in the corner that Bram had sourced from a family in Cartwright, selling off an estate. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Silas." He was in the doorway. "Yeah, you built most of this." "Bram and Holt and Pruitt built most of it. I finished it." "That's not nothing," she said. "That's actually the hardest part. Anybody can start something." He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "It's good," he said simply, about his own work, which was the first time Eloin had heard him say that about anything he'd done, and she let it stand without adding to it. Moving in was less ceremonial than Bram had expected. It was the practical work of relocation, the children's things carried across the yard, the sleeping arrangements reorganized. Petra's immediate establishment of which shelf in the cabin's kitchen corner was hers for her particular organizational system, Bea and Rena determining the interior geography of the sleeping loft, with the focused seriousness of small diplomats negotiating a border agreement. Finn stood in the middle of the cabin's main room and looked around. "It smells like wood," he said. "It's new," Silas said. "It'll change. I like it," Finn said. "You like everything," Petra said. "Not everything," Finn said with dignity. "I didn't like the medicine that time." That evening, for the first time since June, Bram ate dinner in his own house with nobody else in it. Just him at his own table in the quiet he'd had for 4 years before the ravine and the hatchet and the 5 children and everything that had followed. He sat with his plate for a while and listened to the quiet. It was fine. It was what it had always been. But it was also, undeniably, different. Not the house that had changed, but him, his relationship to the silence, the way it had a different texture now, because he knew what was 30 yards away across the yard. Not absence. Presence at a distance, which is a different thing entirely. After supper, he went to the cabin and knocked on the door, which felt slightly absurd given that he'd built the door with his own hands and had been in and out of the cabin approximately 400 times in the past 3 months. Eloin opened it. "The stove drawing right," he said. She stepped aside to let him see. The small stove in the corner was putting out a steady heat and the pipe was clean. "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked around the cabin, at the children in their various evening configurations, Tobin drawing at the table, Petra reading, Bea already asleep on the lower bunk with the efficiency of a child who has decided when bedtime is and intends to honor that decision. Rena watching Silas demonstrate something about the woodworking tool he'd brought in. Finn was on the floor with a piece of wood he was examining with deep personal interest. "You need anything else tonight?" No, Eloin said. "We're all right." He nodded. He was about to go, and then he didn't go, because there was something else that had been present in the air between them for long enough now that, not saying, it had begun to feel like its own statement. "Eloin," he said. She was looking at him in the way she looked at him when she already knew what he was going to say, and was waiting for him to catch up to saying it. "I know this isn't what either of us planned," he said. "Any of it." "No," she said, "it isn't." But he stopped. He was better at doing things than saying them, and he knew it, and she knew it. "I'd like this to be what it is," he said. "Not because of the deed or the legal arrangement. Because of what it actually is." She held his gaze for a long moment. The stove ticked in the corner. Finn found something interesting about his piece of wood, and said so softly to himself. "What it actually is," she said, "is a ranch that was failing. That has a chance now. 5 children who have a home. 2 people who figured out how to trust each other." She paused. "Is that what you mean?" "It's part of it," he said. "I know it's part of it," she said. "What's the rest?" He looked at her. She was 30 years old, and she'd come west in a mail-order arrangement, and been left in a city she didn't know with 5 children and $40. And she'd made it across the ravine country in the summer heat, and she'd lowered a hatchet by. Degrees, because she'd decided he could be trusted. She'd reorganized his chickens and his garden and his water schedule and his legal standing and his relationship with his neighbors and the whole quiet architecture of his daily life. And she'd done all of it while mending other people's clothes for money and teaching her children their lessons and keeping records of everything in an account book that was also, if you read it right, a record of what Cinder Creek had been and what it was becoming. "The rest," he said, "is that I'd like to keep finding out." Eloin was quiet for a beat. 2 beats. "It's a reasonable position," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. He went back across the yard to the main house in the cold December night, and he was smiling in the particular way of someone who is not going to tell anyone they're smiling, and doesn't need to. Christmas came with the community in the way that Christmas does in places where people have been paying attention to each other for long enough to know what the season calls for. The Fennels came, the Holts came, Pruitt came with his wife whom Bram had never met, and who turned out to have opinions about garden soil amendment that she and Eloin discussed for 45 minutes with an intensity that suggested both of them had been waiting for a conversation partner who understood the subject at the level they were operating at. Adler came down from his parcel, which was the longest distance anyone had traveled and which he seemed slightly surprised to find himself doing, the way people are surprised when they discover they've become part of a network they hadn't formally signed up for. The main house and the cabin both, with all the doors open between the cold and the warmth, and the noise of it was something Bram stood outside in the yard for a moment to listen to before going back in the layered noise of people who know each other well enough to argue and laugh about the same thing at the same time. Silas found him standing there. "It's cold," Silas said. "I know, people are inside." "I know that too." Silas stood beside him for a moment, looking at the lit windows of both buildings. He was 13 and a half now, and the raw-boned quality of him had settled into something that was going to be real height. He'd grown 2 inches since June, which his mother was tracking in the account book alongside everything else. Bram Silas said, "Yeah, thank you." He said it the way he said everything important, flat, direct, no decoration on it. For going down into the ravine, Bram looked at the windows. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know I don't have to," Silas said. "I'm doing it anyway." They stood in the cold for another moment, and then they went back inside. The orchard was Eloin's idea, and it came in January, in the way ideas come when the land is resting and the mind has room to move forward, instead of just managing what's immediately in front of it. She showed Bram the sketch she'd made, not a drawing exactly, more like a plan. The property boundary roughed in and a section of the south-facing slope indicated for planting, the kind of ground that got the right sun and had enough depth in the soil for roots. "Apple and pear," she said, "maybe plum. The altitude's right for cold, hardy varieties." Bram looked at the sketch. "Trees take years, yes. Might be 4 or 5 years before they produce." "I know." She looked at the sketch. "I'm planning to be here in 4 or 5 years." He looked up from the paper. "Aren't you?" she said. "Yes," he said, "I am. Then we plant trees." She took the sketch back. "I'll write to the nursery in Denver. They'll have recommendations for this elevation." He watched her fold the sketch into the account book, next to the entries for the winter expenses, and the notation of the good neighbor agreement, and the survey confirmation. All of it together, all of it continuous, the record of a place being built by people who decided to build it, Eloin said. She looked up. He didn't have the words exactly right, and he knew it, and he said it anyway. Because sometimes the imperfect version of a true thing is better than waiting for the perfect version that might not come. "I'm glad I went down." She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I," she said. And then quieter, "So are all of us." In late January, on an afternoon that was cold but still, and clear the way Colorado winters are sometimes still, and clear the kind of day that makes you forget for a moment what the season requires of you, Bram and Eloin stood together outside the main house and looked at the south-facing slope where the orchard would be. Finn was somewhere behind them, explaining something to Bea about the relative merits of 2 different rocks he'd found. The explanation was detailed and authoritative, and slightly wrong in its geology but entirely correct in its enthusiasm. Tobin was inside drawing, Petra was inside reading or managing something that needed managing. Rena had fallen asleep on the window bench, which she did at unpredictable intervals with no apparent relationship to how tired she was. Silas was in the workshop space he'd claimed in the corner of the barn, working on a chair he'd designed himself, the joinery for which he'd been planning for 2 weeks before he touched a piece of wood. The ranch was making its winter sounds, the creak of cold timber, the cattle in the pasture moving slowly, the creek running thin and quiet under its skim of ice at the edges. 6 trees first, Eloin said. Then we see how they take. 6 is a good number, Bram said. We'll plant in April when the ground is workable. She looked at the slope, measuring it with the practical eye she brought to everything. Silas can help dig. It'll be good work for him. He'll want to design the spacing himself. I know, she said with the smallest smile. I'm going to let him. They stood there in the cold afternoon light, the 2 of them looking at a slope of empty ground that was going to be an orchard in a few months, and in a few years would be full and producing, and in more years than that would be the kind of permanent feature of a landscape that outlasts the people who planted it and becomes simply part of what a place is. That was the thing about trees. You planted them knowing you were making a promise to the future, to whoever would be standing on this ground in 20 years, 30 years, looking up at something they hadn't planted, but were benefiting from, the way everyone benefits eventually, from what other people had the patience and the faith to put in the ground before they could see what it would become. Bram Voss had come to Cinder Creek to hold on. That had been the plan, just hold on, keep the land, outlast the debt and the drought and the slow collapse of a thing he'd built alone and couldn't quite sustain alone. He'd been holding on for 4 years when a shattered wagon and a woman with a hatchet and 5 children with nothing between them and the desert had changed the question entirely. Holding on turned out to be the wrong question. The right question was what you were building toward. And you couldn't build toward anything alone. Not really, not the things worth building. Not the kind of thing that has a name and a deed and a future. Not the kind of thing you can point to and say, this is what I was for. This is what the days added up to. He hadn't known that when he went down into the ravine. He'd gone down because someone was in trouble, and going down was what you did. But sometimes the simple thing and the right thing are the same thing. And the life that comes from doing them turns out to be larger and better and harder and more real than anything you'd have arrived at on your own. Eloin had come west with a contract and a hope, and had gotten neither. And out of the ruins of that, she'd built something that no contract could have given her, not assigned, not arranged, but made day by day. with her own hands and her own mind, and the children she'd carried through a ravine in the summer heat, and the man who'd been there at the bottom of it, waiting to help carry them the rest of the way. You don't get to choose most of what arrives at your door. You only get to choose what you do when it arrives. That's the whole of it, really. The choice at the edge of the ravine, the hatchet lowered by degrees, the willingness to say yes when someone asks if you need something, all of it, every bit of it, comes down to the same plain human decision, made again and again in the ordinary moments that don't look like decisions at all, until you look back from a distance and see that they were the whole shape of a life. Finn's voice came from behind them, still explaining the rocks to Bia, who had either given up arguing or had become genuinely interested. Eloin turned from the slope. "Come inside," she said to Bram. "It's cold." "In a minute," he said. She went. He stayed for another minute, looking at the slope, the empty ground that was going to be an orchard, and then he turned and walked back toward the light in the windows of both buildings, his house and theirs, two structures on one piece of ground, one deed with two names on it, one life that had room in it now for all of them. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The cold stayed outside where it belonged, and inside Cinder Creek Ranch held its warmth against the winter the way it would hold it, for all the winters that came after, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but steadily, the way things hold when they've been built by people who decided, against reasonable odds and with full knowledge of the cost, to stay.